I had walked these trails my entire life. The Appalachian Mountains were a place that earned respect. Old, quiet, and always watching. I thought I knew every bend, every trail marker, and each trick of the light that made it seem darker than it really was. But then I saw that unfamiliar path stretching to the right, narrow and barely noticeable. I hesitated. I don't know what drew me to it. Maybe the way the trees arched over, or perhaps the strange silence that seemed even deeper than usual. Despite my better judgment, I turned and stepped into the unknown. After a few steps, the forest grew thicker. The sky was barely visible through the tangled branches, and the air tasted odd, like rust or blood. A sharp sting that burned my throat. The trees were dark and twisted, their trunks bent so low that some almost touched the ground. They looked scorched, as though a fire had swept through and stopped suddenly, leaving the place marked. I stopped, taking in the stillness, a heavy kind of quiet, as though even the birds had learned to avoid it. Then I saw it, a massive scar in the earth, a deep crater so vast I couldn't see the bottom. Charred roots jutted from the sides, clawing toward the center where something caught the light. I moved closer, my steps muffled by the dark dirt. As I reached the edge, I saw what was gleaming. It was a book, a small, worn leather journal, resting at the center of the pit. A shiver ran through me, but I couldn't leave it behind. I lowered myself into the hole, hands digging into the loose earth as I slid down. The journal was colder than I expected, colder than it should have been. The leather was cracked, and the words "Fallen Kingdom" were faintly embossed on the cover. Flipping it open, I saw disturbing sketches. Trees twisted into unnatural shapes, strange symbols carved into stones, creatures drawn in heavy shadowed strokes. Each page seemed to pulse with something dark, something that didn't belong in the daylight. Then I saw a name scrawled on one of the pages, Lewis Caldwell. My blood froze. I knew that name. Lewis Caldwell was my uncle, the one who had vanished into these woods almost 20 years ago. They searched everywhere, combing every trail, every hollow, but they never found any trace of him. Yet here was his journal, as if it had been waiting for me. I looked up, suddenly feeling exposed, as if unseen eyes were watching me from the forest's edge. Shadows shifted at the corner of my vision, shapes that didn't match anything I recognized. The air grew colder, carrying a faint whisper that could have been the wind, but it felt deliberate. My legs tensed, and I scrambled up the side of the crater, clutching the journal tightly. I could feel something watching me, something aware that I had uncovered its secret. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and the forest seemed to close in around me, its silence pressing in, heavy and expectant. I walked faster, nearly jogging, with the journal weighing down my hands. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. By the time I reached the main trail, my heart was racing. I glanced back once, but the trees stood still, as if they had never seen me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had marked me. That night, sleep didn't come. The forest felt suffocating, pressing in on the cabin, a silent watcher waiting just out of reach. I had spent the whole afternoon reading the journal, deciphering Lewis's scrawled notes until the words blurred. I could feel him in every line, his terror, his disbelief. His sketches filled the margins, crude drawings of creatures he had seen in the woods, things that hid between the trees, half-formed faces peering from twisted shadows. One note appeared over and over, written in jagged, heavy handwriting. "Never look behind you." I don't know why I stayed. Maybe it was curiosity or loyalty, a need to uncover the truth about Lewis. Whatever it was, it made me ignore the quiet voice in my head telling me to leave. Instead, I pocketed the journal, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped into the night. The darkness swallowed me whole. The trees were nothing but towering shadows, their gnarled arms blocking out the sliver of moonlight. I moved carefully down the path toward the clearing, feeling my way as if I were blind. Everything seemed sharper at night, the rustling leaves, the whisper of the wind threading through the branches. I kept my steps light, unwilling to disturb the silence. That's when I heard it, a faint crunch somewhere close, like leaves underfoot. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, circling me. I didn't dare turn, didn't want to know what might be watching me from behind. Lewis's words echoed in my head. Never look behind you. I kept moving, telling myself it was just the wind or some animal in the underbrush. But deep down, I knew. I could feel it. A weight just outside my line of sight, something following me, matching my steps. My hand tightened on the flashlight in my pocket, but I didn't dare pull it out. It felt like an admission, like if I turned it on, whatever was out there would know I was aware of it. The footsteps grew louder, each one deliberate, sinking into the silence, drawing closer. My skin prickled with each crunch of leaves, each snap of a twig. I took another step, holding my breath, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, soft but clear, calling my name. A shiver crawled up my spine, icy fingers twisting through my gut. I kept my eyes forward, my pulse pounding in my ears, but that whisper, God, it sounded so close, like someone was standing right behind me. Leaning in, their breath warm against my neck. I could feel its presence, the space it took up in the dark, a cold, patient shadow. I forced myself to keep moving, each step feeling heavier, as though the whisper was following me, relentless, echoing through the silent trees. My mind raced, recalling the stories in Lewis's journal of shadows that took shape, creatures waiting in the dark. I had thought it was just his imagination, his fear. Now I wasn't so sure. Finally, I saw the cabin through the trees, its outline a lifeline in the darkness. I didn't look back, not even when the footsteps stopped, fading into the night. The forest fell silent once more, but I felt it. Even as I crossed the threshold and bolted the door, whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was waiting. I didn't wait long. Something about the stillness felt too heavy, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. I packed quickly, my hands shaking as I zipped up my bag, cramming the journal into my coat pocket. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in around me, pressing me toward the door. I had told myself I would find answers here, but all I had found was fear. Whatever was out there wasn't something I could understand or confront. It was something older, something that didn't want me here. I stepped outside, and the cold night air hit me like a slap. My flashlight barely pierced the dark, its beam shaking as my hands trembled. The silence felt thicker tonight, heavier. I walked quickly, telling myself I just needed to reach the main trail, and everything would be fine. But I could feel it, whatever it was, lurking behind me, just out of sight but never out of mind. My heart pounded in my chest, drowning out the sound of my boots on the dirt. Then I heard it, a low, throaty growl, rumbling from deep in the woods. It was close, far too close, and it wasn't the sound of any animal I knew. I froze, clutching the flashlight, its light trembling as I held it toward the sound. The darkness shifted, something moving just beyond the beam's reach. I caught a glimpse of antlers twisting toward the sky, forming a grotesque crown above a hulking shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I saw its eyes, burning yellow, fixed on me, locking me in place like prey caught in a trap. My legs moved before I knew what I was doing. I turned and ran, tearing down the trail as fast as I could, the journal thumping against my chest with each step. I could hear it behind me, its heavy, deliberate steps closing the distance. Branches lashed at my face, thorns scraping my arms, but I kept going, heart pounding, lungs burning. The trail twisted, and I stumbled, nearly losing my footing. When I looked up, my heart sank. I had come full circle. I was back at the crater, the very place I had tried to leave behind. The beast stood at the edge of the pit, its shadow spilling over the earth, waiting. Its eyes glowed brighter, and a sickening growl rumbled from deep within. I backed away, but the ground beneath me was loose, crumbling. Panic seized me, and for a moment, I thought I might fall into the pit. I reached into my pocket and clutched the journal, gripping Lewis's words like a lifeline. There was a phrase, a desperate incantation he had written to keep the shadows at bay. My voice barely rose above a whisper, but I forced the words out, repeating them louder as the beast drew closer. For a moment, it paused, as if the words had struck it. Its yellow eyes flickered, just for an instant. I took my chance. I scrambled up the edge of the crater, lunged forward, and sprinted through the trees. My legs felt like they would give out any second, but I kept moving, tearing through the forest, every breath ragged. When I finally saw the main trail ahead, I didn't look back. I burst from the trees, collapsing on the dirt path. The forest silence crashed down behind me, but I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it waiting for the next time I dared to return. And a part of me knew that if I did, I would never leave. I worked as a logger, spending my days in the forest chopping down trees for a new housing project. To be honest, I didn't feel great about clearing the land and cutting down trees, but it paid the bills. The forest itself was beautiful and peaceful most of the time, even if it did have its strange moments. The other guys I worked with had found abandoned tents, jackets, and even shoes left behind, but some stories were downright creepy. Once, someone found bones that couldn't be identified, still talked about as the remains of someone who disappeared without a trace. I always thought these stories were just to scare us, but that was before my last week out there. That evening, just before sunset, I went a little further into the woods to get some privacy. I could still hear my two coworkers laughing and talking near the truck, but their voices were faint. I kept walking deeper into the forest, careful of thorny branches or rocks. It was just about 6 p.m., and the light was fading fast. In the winter, it got dark earlier, so we usually packed up by now. I had wandered farther than I should have, but the guys knew I'd be back soon. As I stood there, I suddenly heard a loud snap, a branch breaking nearby. My heart started beating faster. I turned slightly, thinking it was one of my coworkers trying to mess with me. "Nice try, guys," I muttered under my breath, though I felt uneasy. Then I heard another crack, even closer this time, followed by a low, strange laugh. It didn't sound quite right. It had a rasp to it, but I convinced myself it was just them messing around. "Come on, guys," I called out louder. "Let's get out of here, it's getting cold." They didn't answer. I zipped up my jacket, feeling a chill run down my spine. Something didn't feel right. As the last bits of daylight disappeared, the forest felt unnervingly quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then there was another snap, this time from behind a thick, shadowy tree. I spun around, and there it was, a figure tall and strange, half hidden behind a tree about 50 yards away. It was about my height, maybe a little taller, but its head was odd, almost too big, and its eyes red, glowing like embers in the shadows. I froze, unable to move. A thin trail of steam rose from its body in the cold air. It looked like it was breathing heavily, almost like a growl. I could hear every rough, raspy breath. My feet felt glued to the ground. I couldn't tell what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't anything normal. I took a shaky step back, then another, but the thing didn't move. It just stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Finally, I forced myself to turn and run back to the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. My feet stumbled over roots and rocks, but I kept running, hearing only silence behind me. Even when I reached the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching. The next morning, I still felt that same chill from the night before, as though something had followed me back. I barely slept, haunted by the memory of those red eyes and the strange, rough breathing that had echoed through the trees. When I arrived at the job site, the guys were already there, talking in low voices. They looked up when I arrived, and I could tell they were just as spooked as I was, even though they didn't want to admit it. Our boss didn't believe us when we told him what we'd seen. He laughed it off. "You boys have been reading too many ghost stories. It's just shadows and wildlife out there." Then he shrugged. "Now get back to work. These trees aren't going to cut themselves." I didn't argue, but I could tell the others were still on edge. None of us wanted to be there, especially after what we'd seen, but we had no choice. We got to the clearing where we'd been cutting down trees and went straight to work. I tried to focus on my job, trying to ignore the way the forest felt. It was too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Normally, we'd hear birds or squirrels or the wind rustling the leaves, but now there was nothing. Just the hum of the chainsaws and the crunch of our boots on the cold, hard ground. Every so often, I'd glance up, scanning the trees. I knew it was out there. I could feel it, but the forest looked empty. My skin prickled, and every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. The guys were jumpy too. Every time I glanced over, one of them was looking around, squinting into the shadows, just like me. The silence wrapped around us, growing heavier with every hour. Finally, as we were packing up to leave, I heard it again. A growl, deep and low, coming from the south. My heart started pounding. The other guys froze, and I saw the fear flash in their eyes. None of us wanted to move, but we had to know if it was out there. Slowly, we all turned toward the sound, squinting into the fading light. First, there was nothing, just shadows between the trees. Then one of the guys whispered, "There," and pointed. My stomach twisted as I spotted it, the creature from last night. It was closer now, standing still, watching us. Its red eyes blazed in the dim light. I could see the strange shape of its head and the thin steam rising from its skin. It looked more terrifying in the daylight than it had in the dark. Without thinking, my coworker reached into the truck, pulled out a pistol from the glove box, and aimed. Crack. He fired once, then twice, and we saw the creature stumble. The shots hit it in the leg and chest, but it didn't fall. It let out an angry snarl before retreating back into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. We jumped into the truck, barely speaking, and drove back to camp. My heart was racing. My mind was spinning. I didn't know what we had seen, but I knew one thing. Whatever it wasn't going to leave us alone. I didn't want to go back into that forest after what we'd seen. I was ready to quit, to walk away from logging altogether, but we didn't have much of a choice. Our boss was firm, show up or get fired. So there we were, the three of us heading back into the woods as the sun began to rise. Our breath was visible in the cold morning air. The ride was quiet. Nobody spoke. We were all thinking the same thing. Those red eyes and that awful, heavy breathing. My hands were shaking as we parked the truck and got out, each of us carrying our gear, without a word. Every step felt heavier as we moved toward the clearing. The forest was completely silent, not even a bird chirping. Felt like we had walked into a graveyard. We started our work quickly, eager to get it done and get out. None of us wanted to be there longer than necessary, but as the hours passed, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch one of the other guys doing the same. We didn't say anything, but I knew they felt it too. The air was thick with tension, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Finally, we started packing up the equipment, ready to leave. That's when I heard it, the growl. My blood turned to ice as the sound filled the clearing, low and menacing, coming from somewhere to the south. I saw my friends freeze, their eyes wide with fear. We turned, looking toward the trees, but saw nothing. The growl grew louder, echoing around us. It was closer this time, a horrible, rumbling sound that made my skin crawl. One of the guys pointed, and I followed his gaze. There, at the edge of the clearing, was the creature. Its red eyes glowed, staring straight at us. It looked bigger now, angrier. I could see the dark spots where the bullets had hit it, but it didn't seem hurt. If anything, it looked more furious, like it was out for revenge. My coworker with the pistol raised it again, his hands shaking. He fired once, then twice, but the creature didn't even flinch. It took a step toward us, its growl turning into a snarl. My heart pounded as we backed up, moving toward the truck, never taking our eyes off it. "Get in," I shouted, and we scrambled into the truck, slamming the doors behind us. The creature lunged forward, slamming into the side of the truck with a force that rocked us sideways. It let out a horrible scream, a sound I'll never forget, half roar, half wail, like it was something not of this world. My friend floored the gas, and we sped down the dirt road, away from the clearing, away from the thing that haunted the forest. As we hit the main road, the growling faded, but the memory of those red eyes stayed with us. We didn't talk much on the ride back, but we all knew one thing. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't gone. It was still out there, lurking in the dark trees. My name's Henry, and last week, I decided to go out on my own to a secret fishing spot deep in the woods of Vermont, a place my friend Will had told me about. He'd found it just a few days earlier and promised it was filled with big fish. Sadly, he couldn't join me because his daughter was ill, so I had to go alone. I tried my best to follow his directions, but it took me longer than expected, winding through dense trees and rough trails. The air was strangely quiet. Usually, in the woods, I'd hear birds, bugs, or maybe a squirrel, but here it was silent, except for the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of branches. At one point, I stopped because it felt like something was watching me. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but a chill ran down my back. After what felt like hours, I finally made it to the spot, but what I found wasn't a pond. It was much bigger, more like a small, murky lake. Dark water stretched out before me, with shadows from the trees surrounding it, making the place feel eerie. I sat down on a large, decaying log by the shore, unpacked my gear, and got ready to fish. The stillness of the place was unsettling. Usually, by water, you'd hear frogs, bugs, or the occasional splash, but here, there was nothing. I cast my line, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I told myself it was all in my head. After catching a couple of small fish, I suddenly heard a noise from across the water, a sloshing sound, like something moving through the water. Squinting, I tried to make out what it was, but the shadows made it hard to see. Then I spotted it, something crouched by the water, drinking. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear, but it was hunched oddly, almost like it had too many joints or its legs bent in the wrong direction. The skin was shiny, like fish scales, which didn't make sense. My heart pounded as I watched it lift its head, but it was too far to make out any details. Just as I started to convince myself it was just an animal, the creature moved forward and slid into the water without a sound. I tried to focus on fishing again, but my nerves were on edge. Something about this place felt wrong, like I didn't belong. My instincts told me to leave, but my curiosity kept me there, waiting for any sign of movement. Just then, My fishing pole jerked harder than any fish I'd ever caught. Before I could grab it, the pole flew out of my hands and into the water. Stunned, I stared at the ripples spreading across the pond, my heart racing. Something under that dark water was strong enough to pull my pole from my hands. I looked around, but the surface of the pond was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. There was something in that water, something I couldn't see, and it wanted to stay hidden. A chill crept down my spine, like icy fingers on my back. I decided it was time to leave. I might have been overreacting, but there was no way I was sticking around to find out what had grabbed my pole. My hands shook as I packed up, every little noise making me flinch. Even the silence felt different, thicker, as if the forest was holding its breath. Just as I swung my backpack over my shoulder, I heard it. A soft, sloshing sound, unmistakable, coming from right behind me. My body stiffened, and my heart thumped in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, gripping my pocket knife, though I knew it was no match for whatever was out there. That's when I saw it. Just a few yards away, dripping with water and mud, stood the creature I had seen across the pond. But up close, it was even worse. It was bigger than I'd realized, standing on all fours with a strange, twisted posture. Its skin was slimy, scaly, and a sickly green with darker patches. It had long, webbed fingers that ended in sharp claws, and its mouth. Oh, its mouth was wide, stretching almost too far across its face, filled with tiny needle-like teeth. The worst part was its eyes. Small, black, and cold, like it was looking right through me. Its neck was lined with pulsing gills that flared in and out, making a wet, wheezing sound with every breath. The stench hit me then, a thick, rotting smell, like something left to decay in the sun for days. The creature stared at me, then took a slow, deliberate step forward, hissing, its mouth curling into what seemed like a sick grin. I raised my knife, though I knew it wouldn't do much. My hands trembled, but I wasn't going down without a fight. Then, in an instant, it lunged. Instinct kicked in. I swung the knife as hard as I could, hitting one of its gills. It screeched, stumbling back, thick black sludge pouring from the wound. It flinched and snarled at me. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it turned and fled, slinking back into the pond. I didn't hesitate. I dropped everything and ran, crashing through the forest, not daring to look back. By the time I made it to my truck, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. My heart was racing, and I felt like the creature's eyes were still watching me from the woods. I couldn't shake the image of its scaly, slimy skin, that wide grin full of sharp teeth, and the sound of its gills breathing. The entire drive home, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see it chasing me. When I finally made it home, I called Will. At first, he didn't believe me, but there was something in my voice that made him agree to meet up the next day and go back to the pond to see if there was any proof of what I'd seen. As much as I wanted to avoid that place, I needed someone else to see it, so I knew I wasn't losing my mind. The next day, Will picked me up, and we drove in silence. The closer we got, the more my stomach twisted with dread. As we walked through the woods, every noise seemed louder, every shadow darker. Even Will, who usually cracked jokes to lighten the mood, was silent, his eyes scanning the trees. When we finally reached the pond, it looked exactly as it had the day before, dark and quiet. But then I saw them. Footprints, huge, webbed, clawed, leading from the water to the spot where I had been sitting. I pointed them out to Will, my throat dry. He stopped laughing, his face going pale. He crouched to get a closer look. "These are too big for any animal," he whispered, staring at the prints. I nodded, too scared to speak. The prints were deep, like something heavy had stepped there, and they led straight into the water, disappearing into the pond's black surface. We stood there in silence, staring at the water, when we heard a soft splash from across the pond. We both turned at the same time, and a ripple moved across the water, slow and eerie, as if something was swimming just below the surface. The smell hit us then, a rotten stench that made me gag. The ripple grew closer, and then I saw it. The creature's head broke the surface, its black eyes staring straight at us. The gills on its neck pulsed with each breath, making that sickening, wet noise. Will grabbed my arm, his face filled with terror. "We need to leave," he whispered. I didn't need to be told twice. We backed away slowly, eyes locked on the creature as it watched us. Just as we turned to run, it let out a low, guttural growl that sent a chill through my entire body. We ran faster than I've ever run, crashing through branches, not stopping until we were back at the truck. We never went back to that pond. I'm Mark, and last week, I decided to go on a solo trip to a secluded fishing spot deep in the woods of North Carolina that my friend Jake had told me about. He said it was filled with big fish, and though he'd only discovered it recently, he swore it was worth the effort. Unfortunately, his daughter was ill, so he couldn't join me, and I was left to explore on my own. I tried my best to follow his directions, though they were harder to remember than I thought. The journey took longer than expected as I wound my way through thick trees and rugged paths. The air was eerily still. Usually, when I'm in the woods, I hear birds, bugs, maybe a squirrel or two, but here, nothing. Only the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the soft rustling of branches. At one point, I paused, a sense of being watched creeping up on me. I dismissed it as my imagination, but the chill that ran down my spine wouldn't go away. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the spot, but it wasn't a pond. It was more like a small, murky lake. Dark water stretched out before me, and the shadows from the thick trees around it made the whole place feel gloomy. I found a rotting log by the shore and sat down, unpacking my gear to fish. The silence was strange. Usually, by the water, there's a chorus of frogs, bugs, or splashes. But here, there was nothing, just stillness. I cast my line, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After a while, I caught a couple of small fish when I heard something across the water. It was a sloshing sound, like something moving through the water. I squinted to get a better look, but the shadows from the trees made it hard. Then I saw it, a creature crouched by the water's edge, drinking. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear, but it was hunched strangely, as if its joints bent the wrong way. Its skin glimmered oddly, like fish scales, which made no sense. My heart raced as I watched it raise its head, but it was too far for me to make out any details. Just as I started to convince myself it was some normal animal, it moved forward and slipped into the water without a sound. I tried to focus on fishing again, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Every nerve in my body was on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right here, that I didn't belong. My instincts told me to leave, but my curiosity kept me rooted to the spot, watching the water, waiting for any sign of movement. That's when my fishing pole jerked more violently than I'd ever felt before. Before I could react, it flew out of my hands and into the water. I sat there, stunned, staring at the ripples where my pole had just disappeared. My heart was pounding, my hands numb. I'd fished all my life, but I had never felt anything strong enough to yank a pole out of my hands like that. Whatever was in that dark water wasn't normal. I looked around, my eyes darting between the shadows cast by the trees. Seconds passed, and the surface of the pond was still again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something was down there, something I couldn't see, something that wanted to stay hidden. A chill crept over me, like icy fingers on my spine. It was time to leave. Maybe I was overreacting, but there was no way I was staying to find out what had pulled my pole into that dark water. My hands shook as I started packing up, every sound making me flinch. Even the silence seemed different, thicker, like the forest was holding its breath. Just as I slung my backpack over my shoulder, I heard it. A soft, sloshing sound, unmistakable, coming from right behind me. My body froze, and I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. Slowly, I turned around, gripping my pocket knife, though I knew it wouldn't protect me from whatever was out there. That's when I saw it. Standing just a few yards away, dripping with water and mud, was the creature I'd seen across the pond. Up close, it was even worse. It was bigger than I'd thought, standing on all fours with a twisted stance. Its skin was slimy and scaly, a sickly green with darker patches. It had long, webbed fingers ending in sharp claws, and its mouth was wrong. It stretched wide, almost unnaturally so, filled with tiny, needle-like teeth. Its eyes were small, black, and cold, like it was looking right through me. The creature's neck was lined with pulsing gills, which flared in and out with a wet, wheezing noise. I gagged at the smell, a rotting stench that made me want to vomit. The creature stared at me and then took a slow, deliberate step forward, letting out a low hiss. Its mouth curled into something like a sick grin. I raised my knife even though I knew it wouldn't do much. My hands trembled, but I wasn't going down without a fight. Suddenly, it lunged. Instinct kicked in, and I swung the knife as hard as I could, striking its neck, hitting one of its gills. The creature let out a high-pitched screech and stumbled back, thick black sludge oozing from the wound. It snarled at me before turning and fleeing, slinking back into the pond. I didn't wait to see if it would return. Dropping everything, I ran, crashing through the forest, not daring to look back. By the time I reached my truck, I was shaking so much I could barely get the key in the ignition. My heart was racing, and I still felt its eyes on me, watching from somewhere deep in the woods. I couldn't get the image of that creature out of my mind. Its slimy, scaly skin, its wide, grinning mouth, and the awful sound of its gills. The entire drive home, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see it chasing me. As soon as I got home, I called Jake. He didn't believe me at first, who would? But something in my voice must have convinced him. He agreed to meet me the next day and go back to the pond to see if there was any proof of what I had seen. As much as I didn't want to go back, I needed someone else to witness it, just to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. The next day, Jake picked me up, and we drove in silence to the trail. The closer we got, the more my stomach twisted with dread. As we walked through the forest, it was like every noise was louder, every shadow darker. Even Jake, who usually cracked jokes to lighten the mood, was silent, his eyes scanning the trees. When we reached the pond, everything looked just as it had before, still dark and quiet. But then I saw them. Footprints, huge, webbed, and clawed, leading from the water to the very spot where I'd been sitting the day before. I pointed them out to Jake, my throat dry. He stopped laughing, his face going pale as he crouched to get a closer look. "These are too big for any animal," he whispered, staring at the prints. I nodded, too scared to speak. The prints were deep, like something heavy had stepped there, and they led straight into the water, disappearing beneath the black surface. We both stood there in silence, staring at the water when we heard a soft splash from across the pond. Jake and I turned at the same time. A ripple moved across the water, slow and eerie, like something was swimming just below the surface. The stench hit us then, a foul, rotting odor that made me gag. The ripple grew closer, and soon a shape rose just above the water. The creature's head broke the surface, those black, soulless eyes staring straight at us. Its gills pulsed, making that sick, wet sound with each breath. Jake grabbed my arm, his face filled with horror. "We need to leave," he whispered. I didn't need to be told twice. We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the creature as it watched us. Just as we turned to run, it let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills through my entire body. We ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through branches, not stopping until we were back at the truck. We never went back to that pond. When I arrived at the cabin that summer, I was eager to see my cousins. Everything around here felt new. The trees were taller, the air smelled cleaner, and it was much quieter than back in the city. My cousins, Lucas, Sarah, and Eli, were already sitting on the front porch waiting for me. From the look on Lucas's face, I could tell he had something in mind. It was after dinner, and we were relaxing on the porch, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The adults were inside, chatting and laughing, just like they always did. Not long after I got there, Lucas leaned in and whispered, "How about we go camping tonight?" Sarah immediately frowned. "You know Grandma and Grandpa won't let us go out there after dark," she said, glancing at the house. "They've told us 100 times not to go into the woods at night." Lucas shrugged and flashed us his usual grin. "That's why we won't tell them," he said. A thrill of excitement ran through me, though I felt a little nervous. "We could just ask them," I suggested, even though I already knew what Lucas would say. "They'll just say no," he replied, waving his hand. "Come on, it'll be fun. We can set up a tent, tell stories, and be back before sunrise. They won't even know." Eli, who was only 11, looked unsure. "What if we get caught?" he asked, nervously glancing at the house. Sarah looked at me, considering. I was excited, but a small part of me felt uneasy. Then again, what could go wrong? All the kids back at school would say, "Whoa, hello." So I agreed. "Okay, but we have to be careful." Eli sighed but eventually nodded, still looking worried. By midnight, the adults were asleep. We could hear Grandma and Grandpa snoring in their room as we crept past, careful not to step on any creaky floorboards. We quietly slipped out the back door into the cool night. The forest felt different in the dark. During the day, we knew these paths well, but now they seemed darker, even with the moonlight filtering through the trees. Every sound was sharper, every shadow a little scarier. A branch snapped somewhere off to our left, and we all jumped, but Lucas just laughed, trying to lighten the mood. After about 20 minutes, we reached the creek, where a small clearing lay surrounded by trees. Setting up the tent was harder than we thought without a flashlight, but we finally managed it. Once it was up, we huddled around a small battery-powered lantern. Its faint glow was enough to light our faces, but beyond that, everything was pitch black. Lucas rubbed his hands together with a grin. "All right, who has a good story?" Sarah's eyes brightened in the dim light. "I've got one," she said. "Have you guys ever heard of the Raven Mocker?" Eli hugged his knees, looking uneasy. "I don't like that one," he muttered. But Lucas leaned in, clearly excited. We sat in a tight circle, our faces half lit by the lantern's glow as Sarah began. "The Raven Mocker is a spirit that steals the hearts of the dying. It takes the years they should have lived and keeps them for itself." She paused, meeting our eyes. "It can appear as a raven or even as a person, but only medicine men can see it in its true form." Eli's face went pale. "Do we have to talk about this?" he whispered, his eyes darting around, as if expecting something to swoop out of the darkness. Lucas grinned. "It's just a story, Eli," he said, though I could tell he was a little nervous too. "And besides, I have one that's even scarier." Sarah rolled her eyes, but I shivered when Lucas began. "Have you ever heard of the Deer Woman?" They say she looks like a beautiful woman to lure people into the woods. Once she's got you far enough, she changes." He paused, leaning in with a wide-eyed look. "She has hooves for feet and a face like a stag." I glanced at the shadows outside, my throat tightening. The thought of something pretending to be human was chilling, and the idea that something like that might be out there in the dark made me feel like we weren't alone. "All right, enough," Eli said, hugging his knees. "Can we talk about something else?" I decided to jump in, hoping to shift the mood. "What about the Star People legend? They're supposed to be peaceful. They come from the stars to teach us wisdom, and they're not scary." Lucas rolled his eyes. "That's boring," he said. But then his expression grew serious. "My grandpa told me something once, something he swore was true." Sarah's face darkened. "Lucas, don't." But Lucas was undeterred. "He said when he was our age, he saw a skinwalker." The tent fell silent. We all knew about skinwalkers, but none of us liked to talk about them, even the adults. "A skinwalker is a witch," Lucas whispered, "who can turn into animals to do dark magic. My grandpa was out gathering wood with his dad, but they got separated. Then, in the middle of the clearing, he saw a coyote standing on two legs, staring right at him." Sarah whispered, "Lucas, stop." But she looked as curious as I felt. "He thought he was imagining things," Lucas continued, his face pale. "But then the coyote started walking toward him. His body twisted and changed. It had the face of a man, stretched tight over its skull, and it whispered his name." Eli shuddered, holding onto my arm. "I think we should sleep," he said, his voice shaky. Just as we were about to settle down, we heard something outside, a soft dragging sound, like feet moving through leaves. We froze, staring at each other in terror. The sound grew louder, getting closer. Lucas turned to us, his face drained of color. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered. The shuffling came closer with each step, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear, and Eli was gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. Even Lucas looked terrified. "What is that?" Eli whispered. Lucas pressed a finger to his lips and slowly reached for the flashlight. His hand trembled as he unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. We all huddled behind him, straining to see. The flashlight beam swept across the trees, first revealing only shadows and branches. But then something moved. A figure emerged from behind a tree, and my spine went cold. It looked like a coyote, but not like any coyote I'd ever seen. Its body was twisted and stretched, with long, bony limbs that didn't quite fit, and patches of fur were missing. The worst part was its face. It was like someone had stretched a human face over a coyote's skull. Its eyes were dark, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. The creature moved in jerky, unnatural steps, circling our tent. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound. It didn't seem to notice us, at least not yet. It was looking around, its head jerking from side to side, as if it were searching for something. Sarah covered her mouth to keep from screaming, and Eli's grip on my arm tightened. Lucas slowly lowered the tent flap and turned off the flashlight. We all huddled together, barely breathing, hoping it would go away. The shuffling grew louder, coming closer to the tent. Then, in a raspy, distorted voice, we heard it speak. "Help me?" It whispered, each word sounding wrong. Too low, too harsh, as if it were trying to trick us. "Please, help me," it repeated, and Eli began to shake, tears in his eyes. Sarah put her hand on his shoulder, signaling him to stay quiet. We were frozen, not daring to move. The creature pressed against the tent fabric, close enough that we could see its shadow stretching and distorting. A terrible, rotten smell filled the air, like decay mixed with sulfur. I clenched my eyes shut, silently pleading for it to go away. Finally, After what felt like hours, the shuffling noise faded. We stayed frozen, too scared to move, as the sounds moved farther away until the forest was silent again. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, we scrambled out of the tent and ran home, leaving everything behind. None of us dared to look back. The ranch looked even bigger at sunset, with long shadows stretching across the fields. Dad had given me a big task that evening, one he usually wouldn't let me do alone. "Lucas, I need that section of trees cleared out," he said. "It's out by the edge of the property. Pays well if you get it done." He offered more money than usual, and I knew why. Those woods were thick and wild, a place we rarely ventured. But I was saving for a truck, so it seemed worth it. That night, I packed up my gear and set my alarm for early morning. By the time I loaded up the truck with the chainsaw, gas, lunch, and camping gear, the sun was already high. Dad had said I might need to stay overnight just in case, and I didn't mind. It was just trees. How scary could it be? The drive was rough, bumpier than usual. The trees began to close in around me as I got farther, their branches scratching at the sides of the truck, and the sunlight started to fade the deeper I went into the woods. Eventually, I reached the clearing, an overgrown patch of trees. It was eerily quiet, so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I paused for a moment, feeling a strange sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. But when I turned, there was no one there. I shook it off and got to work. The chainsaw roared to life, echoing through the empty woods as I cut the first few trees. It felt good to be working, and I quickly forgot about the odd feeling. But as the hours passed, strange things started happening. One tree I cut just vanished. I swear I had cut it down. The stump was cleanly sliced, but the tree itself was gone. I walked around, searching, but it was gone. I shook my head, convincing myself I must have dragged it off without realizing. When I took a break, the uneasy feeling returned, but stronger this time. It felt like someone was standing just outside my line of sight. I turned quickly, but the trees and shadows were all I saw. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard laughter, soft, like a whisper carried by the wind. I told myself it was just in my head. I was alone, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. I tried to focus on the next tree, but every time I glanced up, the shadows seemed to creep closer, shifting when I wasn't looking. As the sun began to set, casting an eerie golden light over the clearing, the woods felt even more unsettling. When night finally came, I decided to set up camp and finish the job in the morning. I built a small fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. But as I sat staring into the dark woods, I felt that strange sensation again, stronger than ever. It felt like eyes were watching me from every shadow, waiting for me to make a wrong move. The forest, once a place of freedom, felt like it was closing in, holding its breath. Darkness settled over the clearing, swallowing everything beyond the light of my little fire. I sat close to the flames, but the warmth didn't shake the chill that had crept over me. It felt like the woods were alive, breathing slowly, heavily. I could almost feel the shadows cast by the fire moving, but each time I looked, they seemed to freeze as if they didn't want me to notice. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. While eating, I heard it again, a soft rustling just outside the light. I shone my flashlight around, but all I could see were trees, looming like they were closing in on me. Then, out of nowhere, came the laughter again, faint but unmistakable. It sounded like someone just beyond the fire's edge, laughing softly, like they were watching me and finding it all amusing. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. Silence. Not a sound, just the crackling fire and my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I flashed the light through the trees, but there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I sat back down, trying to stay warm and alert, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I didn't want to think about what could be out there, hiding just beyond the trees in the shadows. The stories Dad had told me when I was younger about things in the woods, things that weren't animals, flooded my mind. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Finally, after what felt like hours, I crawled into my tent, hoping I could block it all out and sleep. But as soon as I zipped the tent shut, a loud thump jolted me awake. I froze, listening hard. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. The sound came from near the truck, followed by slow, heavy breathing, too close. My hand trembled as I unzipped the tent just a crack, peeking out into the moonlit clearing. Everything looked still, the truck and trailer parked where I'd left them. But then I saw it, just a glimpse, a tall, thin shadow slipping behind a tree. My heart raced. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I lay there stiff, eyes wide open, listening, feeling the forest closing in around me, like it was waiting for me to make one wrong move. I barely made it through the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the heavy breathing, closer than before. When the first light of dawn broke, I scrambled out of the tent, packed up as fast as I could, and jumped into the truck. My hands were shaking so much it took several tries to get the keys in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I sped off, leaving the forest, and whatever was in it, behind me. When I got home, I didn't tell Dad everything. I just said I'd had trouble with the trailer and didn't want to stay overnight. He looked at me funny, probably because I looked like I hadn't slept in days, but he didn't ask any more questions. He just said we'd go back in the morning to retrieve the trailer I'd left behind. The drive back to the clearing felt slower than ever. Everything looked different in the daylight, almost normal. The shadows were gone, and the trees didn't seem to close in the same way, but my heart wouldn't stop pounding. I could still feel that unease creeping back, reminding me of every sound, every breath I had heard in the dark. When we reached the clearing, the trailer was exactly where I'd left it, still loaded with logs. I helped Dad hook it up to the truck, but as we worked, I felt eyes on me again. I glanced at the trees, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving, tall and thin, slipping behind a tree. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but it was hard to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. On the drive home, that image of the shadow stayed in my mind. I had to know what I'd seen. After Dad went to bed, I snuck into his study. He kept a lot of old books in there, mostly about history, but some were about local legends and folklore. I hadn't paid much attention to them before, but I grabbed one and flipped through it until something caught my eye. A chapter on creatures said to lurk in the deep woods. My hands shook as I read about a creature called the Lurker. It was described as a twisted, shadowy figure that preyed on those who wandered alone in the woods. Known for hiding behind trees, staying just out of sight, and following its victim patiently, it sounded just like the laughter, the breathing, and the shadow I had seen. The next day, I mentioned it to Dad, pretending it was no big deal. He looked at me strangely, then told me that my great-grandfather used to talk about creatures like that. Shadows in the woods that no one could explain. He said some of the locals still refused to go too deep into the forest at night. Now I understood why. Now, every time I pass the edge of our property, I feel it. The same prickling, the same heavy sensation like someone's watching. And deep down, I know that something's out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I won't be going back anytime soon. For years, I felt like something's been stalking me, and I swear I hear it at night just outside my tent. I decided to go on a solo 7-day hike, but it wasn't until the third day that I noticed something was wrong. When I woke up and stepped out of my tent, I saw my small makeshift camp had been ransacked. My gear was scattered, and the small fire pit I had built looked like it had been trampled, as if a huge animal had stepped right through it. The scariest part? The footprints. They were all over my camp, circling my tent multiple times, then coming to a stop at the door before heading off into the woods. I hadn't heard anything while I slept, and I convinced myself it was just other hikers playing a prank. After gathering my scattered supplies, I continued down the trail. The hike was in a remote and rugged area, difficult even for experienced hikers, so I couldn't understand why someone would mess with my camp. Most hikers take their trips seriously. Ruining supplies could easily lead to life-threatening situations from exposure. That day, I hiked for hours, taking switchbacks and pausing now and then to look behind me. The mountain seemed empty. I even wiped away some of my footprints, hoping it would make it harder for anyone to track me. That night, I packed everything into my tent, certain that no one could have followed me. I held my flashlight in one hand, lying in my sleeping bag, waiting for any unusual sounds. And then I heard it. A twig snapping, a bush rustling, and a rock rolling across the ground. Fear surged through me. My initial instinct was to jump out of the tent and shine my light in whoever's face. But the sounds I heard made me freeze. These weren't the sounds of humans. There were no lights, no boots, just the sound of something animalistic, maybe a large bear or a wolf pack. The sounds grew louder, and I realized it had to be more than one creature. They circled my tent, pawing at the ground, breathing heavily. Then came a strange, guttural noise, a demented version of a laugh. Yook, yook. The creatures continued to circle, never coming close enough to touch the tent, but the laughter was constant. Fear gripped me, and I instinctively curled up in my sleeping bag, trying to hide like a child fearing the monsters under the bed. The creatures outside became more frantic, their laughter intensifying. I covered my ears, desperate to block out the noise, but then, as suddenly as it started, the sounds faded into the night. The torment stopped. My breath came in short bursts as I lay there, terrified. Being alone on this mountain had been a terrible idea. Hikers went missing here regularly, but I had always thought they were just inexperienced and lost. Now I knew better. There was something else out here, something real and terrifying. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, too afraid to leave the tent, fearing the creatures might be waiting outside. When the first light of dawn crested over the hill, I knelt and prayed, something I hadn't done in years. Normally, I didn't put much stock in religion, but that morning, I pleaded for help, hoping some divine force would take me off the mountain. Nothing came. When I finally ventured out, the camp was in chaos. The ground was torn up with strange, overlapping footprints. They were deep, larger than any animal tracks I knew, but not human. I followed the trail leading down the mountain, which was the way I had come. By my estimate, I was over halfway through my hike, and it would take me a few more days to get to the peak and then down to the parking lot where my truck was waiting. I hiked hard, moving quickly and avoiding distractions. I made it to the plateau by evening and paused only for a moment to take in the view. Normally, I would have taken my time at the top, savoring the beauty, but today I couldn't afford to linger. The sun was setting, and I needed to find shelter. I spotted a clearing ahead and decided to set up camp there. The trees behind me, with their twisted branches, seemed to offer protection. I worked quickly, constantly looking over my shoulder, knowing the creatures would come at night. Sweat ran down my neck as I finished setting up my tent, and I gathered firewood, making sure I had enough to keep the flames burning for hours. As I ate, I had an idea. Grabbing my flashlight and climbing gear, I scaled a tree for a better vantage point, hoping I could spot the creatures before they reached my camp. I stayed there, tense and silent, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise came soon enough. A twig snapping, a bush rustling, and the careful steps of something drawing closer. I watched the ground below, barely breathing, as shadows moved through the darkness, circling my camp. There were too many to count. Then, I heard the same strange laugh from one of them. Yuk yuk! Suddenly, the campfire erupted. Logs flew through the air as if struck by a giant hand. I could make out the shape of a large creature, a paw, a muscular hind leg, all covered in brown fur. The creatures began pacing around the camp, tearing up the earth and laughing that eerie, throaty laugh. I could hear my tent tearing and deep, inhuman growls. The sound of heavy breathing echoed through the night. For hours they searched, never leaving until just before dawn, when they quietly retreated back up the mountain. I hadn't slept at all, and I was exhausted. My legs felt weak as I climbed down from the tree, landing hard on the rocky ground. My ankle twisted painfully, but I didn't care. I had to keep moving. I could see my truck far below in the parking lot, but it was still so far away. The trail was treacherous, rocky, and steep. I backtracked several times, searching for a different path. It felt like it took forever, but I kept pushing myself. I couldn't spend another night on that mountain. As I neared the base, the sun dipped lower, and I doubled my pace, desperate to make it to my truck. Finally, I found the rappel site, a series of anchors in the rock with a bright green rope hanging down. I attached myself to the line and began descending, but halfway down, something yanked on the rope, jerking me back up the mountain. I climbed faster, desperation flooding me as I descended. When I reached the bottom, I noticed the rope had shortened. I unhooked myself and dropped to the ground, landing awkwardly and twisting my ankle again. But I was on the final stretch. My truck was within sight. I limped forward, ignoring the pain in my leg. Then I heard it, the sound of rocks shifting as something heavy landed behind me. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the heavy breathing of whatever was following. Ahead, I ducked into a small thicket of young trees, hoping they wouldn't see me. The growl came again, and I froze, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The creature passed by so close that I could feel its hot breath on my neck. I risked a glance and saw it, a horrifying, wolf-like creature with large teeth, its skin pulled back in a grotesque snarl. Its eyes were all white, clouded over as if it were blind. It sniffed the air and growled before moving away, mocking my fear with its strange laugh. As it vanished into the woods, I quietly limped towards my truck. I reached the parking lot and got inside, locking the doors behind me. I took a deep breath, finally feeling safe. I started the truck, and as I turned on the headlights, my heart stopped. In front of me, I saw the creatures, dozens of them, crouched low, their eyes white and unseeing. When my headlights hit them, they recoiled in pain, and I floored the gas pedal, speeding off down the mountain road. One of the beasts slammed into my tailgate, but I didn't stop. I swerved, keeping ahead of them as they chased me. My ankle throbbed with pain, but I barely noticed as adrenaline surged through me. In my rearview mirror, I saw them closing in, but I didn't look back. I kept pushing forward, speeding down the road until I saw other cars and knew I was safe. I drove nonstop until I reached my home, exhausted and shaken. The sun was setting as I locked the door behind me. I took a deep breath and poured myself a drink to calm my nerves. But just as I settled into bed, I heard something outside, something scratching at my door. Then came the deep, mocking laugh. Yuk yuk. The air before dawn was sharp as I zipped up my jacket, the cold breeze creeping under my skin. testing my resolve. This wasn't just another fishing trip. It was part of a tradition that felt as old as the mountains around our small town. My brother Lucas, our friends Tom, Paul, and Mike, and I gathered at the docks, where our boat bobbed gently, ready for the day ahead. The sky was still dark, stars sparkling like the last embers of a dying fire. The marina was quiet at this hour, disturbed only by the soft sound of gear being loaded and the distant cry of a seabird starting its day. I glanced over at Lucas, who was carefully arranging the fishing rods and tackle boxes, his movements slow and deliberate, a routine that had been perfected over the years. "John, grab the cooler, would you?" he called, not looking up from his task. I lifted the cooler onto the boat, the cans inside making their familiar clinking sound, always a reminder of these trips. It wasn't long before Mike popped open a beer, the hiss of the can breaking the morning's quiet. He grinned, shrugging. "Never too early, right?" I shook my head, laughing. "You'd crack open coffee if it came in a can." As we set off, the engine hummed beneath us, cutting through the calm water, leaving the marina behind. The eastern horizon began to glow with orange and pink, a promise of the day ahead. Tom and Paul were already swapping stories from last year's trip, each one more exaggerated than the last. Their laughter blended with the sound of the engine, creating a comfortable background to our journey. Fishing had always been more than a hobby for us. It was a way to reconnect with something timeless and raw. My dad had introduced me to it when I was just a little kid, and I always knew I'd pass these skills and stories down to my own children one day. "Heading to the usual spot?" Tom asked, his voice cutting through the wind. "Yeah," I replied, nodding to Lucas, who was at the helm. "The cove should be perfect today." The trip to the cove was a tradition in itself. Each landmark we passed a memory in the making. The jagged outline of Peak Mountain, the valley where we camped that one unforgettable summer, the secluded beaches where we'd done things we'd never admit to. Each place brought its own rush of nostalgia. As the light grew, the world around us came alive. The water shimmered under the sun's first rays, shifting from black to a deep, rich blue. Seagulls soared overhead, their calls blending with the rhythm of our boat's engine. Lucas steered the boat with ease, his focus on the horizon. He was always the cautious one, with a respect for the water that ran deep in him. As the mist began to rise off the water, I felt a familiar excitement bubble up. This was freedom, being surrounded by nature, fishing lines cast into the endless blue, waiting for a tug. We anchored in the cove, the water around us calm and inviting. The thick trees surrounding the cove stood tall like silent guardians. I stepped off the boat, the wood beneath my feet solid and familiar. "Here we are, boys," I said with a wide grin. "Let's catch some memories." The day drifted by, the sun climbing higher, its warmth easing the coolness of the breeze. We each settled into our rhythms, casting, reeling, and chatting. Mike, who had cracked that first beer, had long since lost count of how many more he'd had. The laughter and stories continued, and then Rich hooked something big. His rod bent low, the line pulled tight. "Now that's what I'm talking about," he shouted, straining to reel it in. We crowded around him, cheering him on. The camaraderie in moments like this was what made fishing special for us. It wasn't just about the fish, but about the shared struggle and triumph. But when Rich finally hauled the fish onto the boat, a shift came over the group. The sunlight seemed to waver, like a cloud had passed over the sun, but it didn't pass. Instead, the light dimmed strangely. A sudden chill ran down my spine, and I could feel the change in the air. "Anyone ever see fog roll in this fast?" Jeff asked, his voice tight with unease. Lucas, staring into the creeping mist, shook his head. "This cove, something's off," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. There was a weight to his words, as if he recognized something we couldn't see. Within minutes, the fog enveloped us, the shore and the water disappearing into a thick white blanket. The joke stopped, and a silence fell over the group. As the visibility dropped to almost nothing, I spoke up. We should try to get a signal out. Let the families know we might be late. My suggestion was more out of practicality than concern. But as the fog thickened, I could sense a growing unease. Let's head to shore, Rich suggested. Maybe higher ground will help us get a signal. We moved closer to the shore, the boat's engine whispering against the thick fog. I grabbed the emergency flares from beneath my seat, a precaution I had a gut feeling we might need. Once on shore, we tied the boat as best as we could. The fog was eerie, the trees looming like shadowy figures, and we used our phones as makeshift torches, the beams weak in the heavy mist. The ground beneath us was soft and soggy, and the air smelled of damp earth. It was a familiar scent, one I associated with the woods, but now it felt foreboding. As we made our way through the woods, the fog seemed to thicken, and an unsettling silence filled the air. No birds, no insects, nothing moved except for us. Then, breaking the quiet, a sharp clicking sound started up. It came from all around us, rhythmic and unsettling, like a signal of some sort. We froze, listening. The clicking grew louder, as if something or someone was communicating. "Turn off the lights," Rich whispered. His voice was barely audible. We clicked off our phones, plunging into darkness, our hearts pounding in the thick, quiet air. The clicking stopped abruptly, replaced by an even heavier silence. It wasn't empty, though. It was full, heavy with the presence of something unseen. My mind raced with every scary story I'd ever heard about these woods. Rich's hand on my shoulder was the only thing that grounded me. His grip was firm, a silent message to move carefully. We began to retrace our steps, walking slowly, trying not to make a sound. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, afraid it might give us away. We hadn't gone far when the bushes rustled violently, followed by a primal scream that made my blood run cold. The forest no longer felt like just trees and mist. It felt alive, hostile. "Run!" Rich hissed urgently. We turned and sprinted, the sound of more rustling and stomping behind us, as if something large was chasing us. Without thinking, I fired the flare gun, aiming blindly. The red light illuminated the trees for a split second, revealing more than a dozen figures dressed in what looked like tribal clothing, some holding spears. Jeff stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and hit the ground hard. He barely cried out before Rich was there, pulling him up and moving him forward. We didn't dare look back. The sight of those figures was enough to fuel our desperation. The boat was our only hope, but it felt so far away. The forest seemed to fight us, branches slapping us, roots tripping us. But fear pushed us forward, its grip tightening with each step. We finally broke through the trees, panting and disoriented. "Start the engine," I shouted hoarsely as I reached the boat. Lucas, who'd been anxiously waiting, didn't hesitate. The engine roared to life just as we jumped aboard and pushed off from the shore. The figures stood motionless at the water's edge, watching us as we put distance between us and them. I fired the last flare, more out of a need to see than to scare them. The flare arced through the air, casting a brief, eerie glow on the figures standing at the shoreline. Then the light died, leaving only darkness behind. None of us spoke as we sailed away, the night's terror lingering in the silence. The fog eventually lifted, revealing the stars once more, but the weight of what we'd experienced remained. We took turns keeping watch until the sun rose, though I'm sure none of us truly slept. Mike, oblivious to everything, had missed it all, and part of me envied his ignorance. As we headed back to the marina at dawn, the world seemed different, Or maybe it was us who had changed. The water lapped gently against the hull, an ordinary sound in what now felt like an extraordinary world. The echoes of the night's terror remained, a reminder that some places and some mysteries are best left unexplored. There's a secluded lake just a short walk from my house in Northfield, New Hampshire. I've been fishing there ever since I moved in. It's tucked away from any roads or houses, making it the perfect spot for privacy. Most of the time, I'm the only one out there, and I leave my kayak in the same spot by the shore when I'm not using it. It's much easier than hauling it back and forth from home. I store it against a large tree, heavy enough that it won't fall over during a windstorm, and I cover it to keep animals from nesting in it. One warm evening in late summer, I had been fishing for about an hour, already catching a few trout which I had stored in my cooler. It was dusk, with the last bits of daylight fading behind the trees. I planned to head back soon, but then I heard noises coming from the lake's edge. I turned and saw someone standing there, tipping a barrel over and spilling something into the water. It seemed like they were dumping something harmful into the lake. Without thinking, I shouted, "Hey, what are you doing?" The person looked up at me and quickly ran into the woods, leaving the barrel's contents still spilling into the water. I squinted at the liquid. It looked like a dark red substance, though with the light fading, I couldn't be sure. A wave of unease washed over me. As someone who loves nature, seeing people polluting the environment disgusts me, and I couldn't just ignore it. But I also didn't feel comfortable staying there anymore. I decided I'd report it to the Environmental Protection Agency. I paddled my kayak back to my usual spot and unloaded my gear, then pulled it out of the water. As I was covering the kayak, I heard a loud snap, like something heavy breaking underfoot. I turned to see who it was, but decided against confronting anyone. I hurried to cover the kayak, not even bothering to stand it up against the tree like I usually do. This time, I left it lying on the ground and grabbed my gear and cooler, quickly walking out of the woods towards the road. It only took a few minutes to get back to the house, but I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was following me. I stashed my gear in the shed, then rushed inside, locking the door behind me with a sense of dread. I rinsed the fish and put them in the fridge to cook tomorrow. For dinner, I just heated up leftovers. As the food warmed up in the microwave, I heard a knock at the front door. My stomach dropped. Who could it be, especially this late at night? The lights were on, and my car was in the driveway. Whoever it was knew I was home. I had all the blinds closed so no one could see inside. Another knock came, louder this time, followed by a man's voice calling through the window. "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier. I'd like to explain myself." There was no way I was opening the door for him. This felt wrong, like he was following me. He kept knocking and shouting, so I decided to respond. "Leave now or I'll call the cops." He answered calmly, saying, "If you could just open the door, I'll explain everything." I repeated my threat, and then I didn't hear his voice anymore. I quickly locked all the windows, turned on the air conditioner, and made a report to the non-emergency police line about the barrel and the man. I also filed an online report with the EPA. Doing that made me feel a little safer, but I'm a light sleeper, so when I heard a crash downstairs around 2 a.m., I immediately jumped out of bed and grabbed my gun from the closet. I heard slow, cautious steps coming up the stairs. I loaded the gun and hid behind my dresser, aiming at the door. I could tell someone was creeping toward me, and sure enough, I heard the doorknob turn and the door creak open. A figure stood in the doorway, and I quickly turned on the lamp to let him see my gun. I yelled, "Get on the ground now." He raised his hands, seeming to try and calm me down, but I noticed a small knife in his hand. I ordered him to drop it, and he calmly said, "I'm leaving," then turned and ran for the stairs. I yelled at him to stop, but he didn't. I heard the door slam open as he bolted out of the house. I rushed downstairs and locked the door immediately, then called 911. I stayed by the shattered window, watching for any sign of him until the police arrived. I told them about my earlier report and the strange events. They accompanied me to the lake to look for the barrel, but after searching for 20 minutes, we couldn't find it. It seemed he had taken it with him. I gave the police my best description of the man. A short, bearded guy with a receding hairline and glasses, wearing a black flannel shirt and black pants. After they left, I stayed up the rest of the night, gun at my side, watching TV. There was no way I was sleeping with a broken window and a potential stalker out there. At dawn, my brothers came over to help me fix the window. Dale stayed at the house with me while my other brother and I went to Home Depot to get the replacement parts. My theory is that the barrel contains something far worse than just liquid, maybe human remains dissolved in acid. Why else would the man follow me home and break into my house? Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it usually is. I know that if I had opened that door, things could have turned out very differently. Ever since I was a child, I've always had a deep love for the outdoors. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot, the distant call of birds, the fresh scent of the forest. It felt like music to me. So, when the fall of 1982 came around, I couldn't resist taking one last camping trip before winter set in. I lived in Manchester, New Hampshire, close enough to nature, but this time I decided to head to Baxter State Park in Maine. I had heard it was a hidden wilderness, perfect for someone like me who wanted a bit of peace and quiet. I remember the day clearly. My wife was at work, and the kids were at their grandmother's, leaving me free to do as I pleased. Without a second thought, I called in sick at work, a little white lie to give myself a break. I loaded up my old Bronco, carefully securing the canoe to the roof. I felt a pang of guilt for sneaking away, but the lure of the wild was too strong to ignore. The drive to Baxter State Park was a mix of excitement and anticipation. I remember how the sunlight filtered through the autumn leaves, casting a golden glow over the road, making it feel like I was driving through a painting. When I arrived at the park, I was struck by its vastness and isolation. It was exactly what I needed, somewhere to disconnect from the world. I drove to the launch site, unloaded my canoe, and paddled into the heart of the park. The water was perfectly still, like a giant mirror reflecting the blue sky and surrounding trees. It was so peaceful, just the sound of my paddle dipping into the water and the occasional bird call. After a few miles, I found the perfect camping spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a view of the lake. I paddled to shore, feeling proud of my choice. Setting up camp was easy. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and set up a chair to sit in. As the fire crackled and the sun set over the lake, I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. It was like all the worries and noise of the world had been left behind. As night fell, the temperature dropped, but it was a comfortable chill, just the kind of cold that makes sitting around a fire feel better. I roasted some marshmallows, enjoying the simple pleasure. Then, tired from the day's journey, I crawled into my tent. Lying there, I listened to the sounds of the night, crickets chirping and the occasional splash of a fish in the lake. It was the perfect end to a perfect day. But little did I know, the peace would soon be shattered. That night, I was jolted awake by a sound. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but then I heard it again. A rustling noise, like something moving outside my tent. My heart began to race, and I lay there holding my breath, trying to figure out what it could be. In the deep woods, your mind can play tricks, especially at night. Maybe it was just a raccoon or a deer, I told myself, trying to stay calm. But there was something about the way the sound moved, heavy and deliberate, that didn't seem right. I remembered reading about moose and black bears in this area. Moose could be dangerous if startled, and bears, well, they're bears. I kept telling myself that animals usually avoid humans, but the thought didn't make me feel any better. The noises stopped right outside my tent, and my heart skipped a beat. Felt like whatever was out there knew I was inside. I strained my eyes in the darkness, trying to make out any shape or shadow, but it was pitch black. The only thing I could hear was the sound of something sniffing and breathing heavily. After what felt like forever, the creature, or whatever it was, seemed to lose interest and moved away. I heard the branches snap as it disappeared into the woods. That's when I realized it was walking on two legs. Wide awake now, I tried to make sense of it. People don't just wander around in the middle of the night in places like this. What else could walk on two legs and sniff around tents in the dead of night? The next day was a blur. I tried to brush off the incident, telling myself it was just a curious hiker or maybe a park ranger. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The forest, which had once felt so welcoming, now seemed menacing, like eyes were watching me from all directions. As the sun began to set, my unease turned into genuine fear. I kept thinking about that two-legged creature from the night before. Deciding to stay in my tent, I kept my revolver close. I wasn't much of a gun guy, but out here it felt necessary. That night, the forest came alive with noises again. But this time, it was different. I could hear movement all around my tent. Shadows shifted in the moonlight. I heard sniffing, grunting, and raspy breathing. Sounds unlike anything I had ever heard before. My mind raced with panic. What was happening? The shadows around my tent seemed too tall, too big to be any animal I knew. And there were so many of them. I counted at least 5 or 6 moving around. Fear gripped me. I was trapped in my tent, with only a thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was out there. And that was the scariest part. I lay there, frozen with fear, hearing their growling and snorting growing louder. Every hair on my body stood on end, and my heart raced. I had to do something. I grabbed my revolver, my hands trembling. I wasn't sure if I could even use it, but it gave me a small amount of courage. Then, without warning, the growling turned into a terrifying chorus, as if they were communicating or preparing for something. That's when it hit me they were planning to attack. I couldn't just sit there. In a split second of pure adrenaline, I fired the revolver straight into the air. The shot echoed through the night, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. That was my chance. I didn't think twice. I tore through the tent, not even bothering to unzip it, and ran as fast as I could toward the lake where my canoe was. Branches whipped against my face as I ran, and I could hear them behind me, their footsteps pounding the ground. I didn't dare look back. My legs felt like jelly, but fear pushed me forward. Finally, I reached the canoe, threw it into the water, and jumped in, paddling like my life depended on it. I didn't stop until I reached the middle of the lake. Once I felt I had some distance, I stopped paddling and looked back toward the shore. My blood ran cold. There, on the riverbank, were 6 figures, crouched down, eyes glinting in the moonlight, watching me. They looked like giant coyotes or wolves, but something about them was off. Then, one by one, they did something that made my heart stop. They stood up on their hind legs. They stood there like humans, but they were far from human. Felt like a nightmare come to life. The howling started, a chilling sound that echoed across the lake. I turned the canoe around and paddled as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached my truck. I drove home that night, not stopping for anything. When I got back, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? I knew what I had seen, but it was too unbelievable, too terrifying to be real. But it was real, and it changed me. I haven't been back to the woods since that night. I'm not sure I ever will. The wilderness used to be my sanctuary, but now it's just a reminder of that night. A night when I came face to face with something I couldn't explain, something that defied all logic. That night, I learned some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was just another regular Friday, or so I thought, as I relaxed in the living room. The sunlight stretched lazily across the floor of our house, tucked away at the edge of a thick forest. Our home felt like a peaceful retreat from the busy town. My brothers, Drew and Jake, were upstairs, immersed in their video games, their laughter and shouts occasionally drifting downstairs to me. Michael, the oldest, was supposed to be in charge, but he was too absorbed in a phone call with his girlfriend to care about any of us. I'm Sophie, by the way, 16 now, but I was 14 back then. I have long, mocha brown hair with lighter streaks and deep black eyes. I'm the only girl among my brothers. That day, I was wearing a casual white long-sleeve shirt and dark gray sweatpants, a typical outfit for a relaxing day at home. As I scrolled through my phone, a sudden knock on the sliding door leading to the porch made me look up. I frowned, peering through the glass, but saw nothing. I assumed it was just a branch or some animal, so I shrugged it off and went back to my phone. But the knocking persisted, louder and more urgent this time. Curiosity piqued. I put my phone down. The woods were usually our playground, familiar and safe, but something felt different that evening. The sun was dipping below the trees, casting long shadows that turned the familiar woods into something eerie. Probably just Drew trying to scare me. I muttered to myself as I stood up. I wasn't easily scared, but the emptiness of the house, with only the distant sound of video games, made me feel unusually isolated. Michael's voice, muffled from his room, didn't offer much comfort. I approached the sliding door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The knocking had stopped, and for a moment, I thought about calling Michael. But pride and the confidence I'd gained from countless afternoons playing in those woods kept me from asking for help. I slid the door open just enough to peek outside. The cool evening breeze brushed my face, carrying the earthy scent of the forest. I stood still, holding my breath, but heard nothing except the rustling of leaves. "Hello!" My voice came out as a cautious whisper, half hoping for no response. Silence greeted me, and I pushed the door open a little wider. Stepping onto the porch, the wooden planks felt cold beneath my feet. The usual comforting creaks now sounded foreboding. I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it. A figure partially hidden by an old, twisted tree. It stood perfectly still, and for a moment, I thought it was one of my brothers playing a prank. But then, the figure moved. No, it shifted in a way that didn't seem right. In the fading light, I couldn't make out any facial features, just a dark void where a face should have been. A chill ran through me, and suddenly, the woods didn't seem so inviting. My mind screamed for me to run, to call out for Michael, but my feet felt frozen, as if the cold had seeped into my bones. The figure took a step forward, and that snapped me out of my trance. I stumbled backward, slammed the sliding door shut, and locked it. My heart raced as I backed away, my eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had been. When I reached the safety of the couch, I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the shadows. But fear settled in, a reminder that the woods, as familiar as they were, hid secrets deep within them. And tonight, one of those secrets had come to our doorstep. I sat back on the couch, clutching my phone with trembling hands, every nerve on edge, alert to every sound and movement around me. Michael's voice still floated down from upstairs, but it sounded so far away, almost as if it were coming from another world. Drew and Jake's game noises faded into a background hum. My heart pounded painfully as I tried to convince myself that what I'd seen was just a figment of my imagination. I couldn't sit still. The image of the figure by the tree haunted me, summoning what little courage I had left. I decided I needed to know if it was real or just a trick of the light. "You're being ridiculous, Sophie," I whispered to myself as I stood up. The safety of the brightly lit room called me to stay, but the unanswered questions pushed me back toward the door. Slowly, I moved toward the sliding door, my fingers trembling as they reached for the lock. The click of the latch seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet evening. I slid the door open just a crack, peering out into the twilight that had settled over the woods. Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the porch. The cool evening air was a sharp contrast to the warmth of the house. My eyes darted around, searching for any movement. Then, out of nowhere, the figure emerged from behind the tree, closer this time. The sight of a white mask with a wide, eerie smile sent a bolt of fear through me. It wasn't a prank. This was something else, something far more sinister. Before I could process it, the figure sprinted toward me with terrifying speed. My breath caught in my throat, and instinctively, I turned to run. But it was too late. I felt a tight grip on my hair, yanking me backward. A scream tore from my throat, desperate and loud. Then, a gunshot shattered the night. The grip on my hair loosened, and I stumbled forward, freed. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the house, and another gunshot rang out, echoing through the woods, followed by a pained scream from behind me. I slammed the sliding door shut, locking it. Michael stood on the porch, shotgun in hand, breathing heavily as he scanned the dark woods for any more danger. "Sophie, are you okay?" he called, his voice filled with concern. I nodded, unable to speak, my whole body shaking. Michael stepped back inside, his presence a comforting shield against the horrors outside. He locked the door behind him and turned to me, his face a mix of relief and anger. "I heard you scream. I got there as fast as I could. Did he hurt you?" "No, I'm okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible. We both knew I was shaken, but physically unharmed. We didn't talk much after that. The sound of police sirens filled the air minutes later as our parents arrived home. The night became a blur of questions, lights, and the comforting embrace of my mom. For months later, the news reported the capture of the masked figure, linking him to serious crimes. As I watched the report, a chill ran through me as I remembered that close call. I wondered why he had picked that night and what might have happened if Michael hadn't been there with his shotgun. The thought was chilling, and even now, I shudder to think how differently it could have ended. Let me start with a bit of background. I'm a 25-year-old guy who's into anything outdoorsy. Camping, hiking, skating, swimming, you name it. If it involves being outside, I'm there. But this story isn't about a fun adventure. It's about the time I stepped into something right out of a nightmare. This all happened in late October 2017 in the remote parts of Glacier National Park, Montana. My friends Jake, Ryan, and Emma and I were hyped for the trip. We all shared a love for the wild and had been planning it for weeks. I'd heard those eerie tales about strange disappearances in parks, but I shrugged them off. That couldn't happen to us, I thought. Prepping for the trip was part of the excitement. I packed up all the essentials: tents, food, warm clothes, and a special box of dragon's breath shells my uncle gave me for my shotgun. I had no idea at the time how much I'd come to rely on them. The drive from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to Montana was an adventure itself. It took 4 days, with us taking turns driving and staying in quirky motels along the way. The food we ate at random gas stations was questionable, but it added to the fun. As we got closer to the park, the scenery became breathtaking. Snow-dusted peaks rose high, and the air felt crisp. The anticipation in our car was electric. When we arrived, the sight of the park stunned me. It wasn't just beautiful. It was wild, untamed, and alive. We found a spot about 15 miles deep into the park to set up camp. It was perfect, surrounded by trees and with a clear view of the sky. We spent the afternoon putting up tents and lighting a fire, laughing and enjoying the escape from our daily routines. By the time the fire was roaring and dinner was cooking, the sun had dipped below the horizon. Everything felt perfect until it didn't. At one point, I stepped away from the fire to relieve myself. As I stood among the trees, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just the cold. It was something deeper, a creeping sense that we weren't alone. The wind through the trees seemed to howl a little too mournfully, and the shadows felt like they were watching. I shook it off and headed back to the fire, not wanting to scare anyone with my unease. That night in my sleeping bag, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I listened to the rustling trees and the crackle of the fire, but my mind kept replaying stories I'd heard about strange disappearances and mysterious creatures. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling stayed with me until I finally drifted off. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of movement outside the tent. My heart raced as I strained to listen. Was it an animal? Something else? I lay frozen as the sound grew closer, then stopped. After a while, I convinced myself it was just a deer and managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, the sun shining on the snowy trees made everything feel normal again. We had breakfast, joked about the night, and planned a day of hiking. The woods seemed less threatening in the daylight, and we spent the day exploring, taking in the stunning views. But as night fell again, the unease returned. After we sat around the fire and went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The following morning, something was different. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves. Ryan, half asleep, muttered something about it being weirdly quiet. Emma seemed concerned, while Jake just laughed, brushing it off as paranoia. That afternoon, while Jake and Emma were setting up camp, I wandered a little too far on my own. That's when I found Ryan lying motionless in the snow. An icicle, or something resembling one, was lodged in his neck. My heart stopped. This wasn't an accident. Something had attacked him. Panic set in as I realized we weren't just dealing with the wilderness. Stories of strange creatures came flooding back to me. Could it be one of those things like a skinwalker or a wendigo? I forced myself to calm down and headed back to camp. When I told Jake and Emma what happened, they were horrified. We decided to stick together and stay close to the fire that night. Every little sound in the forest sent shivers down our spines. Sleep was impossible, and we took turns keeping watch. I clutched my shotgun tightly, feeling both scared and determined to protect us. At dawn, we decided it was time to leave. The silence of the forest made the journey unbearable, and every step felt like something might jump out at us. At one point, Emma froze and pointed toward the tree line. "I saw it," she whispered. "It's huge, watching us." A terrifying chase began, with the creature throwing sharp, icy projectiles. I yelled for Jake and Emma to run ahead to the car while I faced it. With my shotgun loaded with the dragon's breath shells, I stood my ground. The creature was monstrous, with glowing yellow eyes, but 2 fiery blasts from the shells took it down. Shaken but alive, we made it back to the car and drove off in silence, leaving behind the nightmare. That trip changed us forever. We went into the woods as carefree friends and left as scarred survivors. Though we drifted apart, I couldn't let go of what happened. I started researching and eventually joined a group of hunters dedicated to fighting these creatures. The Rockies showed me a darker side of the world, and now I've made it my mission to protect others from it. Ever since I was a kid, I've always had this deep love for being outdoors. The crunch of leaves under my boots, the far-off cry of a loon, and the fresh, earthy smell of the forest. It always felt like a song for my soul. So, in the fall of 1983, when I got the chance to take one last camping trip before winter arrived, I jumped at it. Back then, I lived in Concord, New Hampshire, not too far from nature's doorstep. But this time, I was drawn to a place I'd heard about for years, Baxter State Park in Maine. People said it was a pristine wilderness, perfect for someone like me who craved a little solitude. I remember that day like it just happened. My wife was tied up at the hospital, and the kids were spending the weekend at their grandmother's. With no one expecting me at home, I decided to take a small break. I called in sick at work, just a little fib for some much-needed rest. I packed up my old Chevy Blazer, made sure the canoe was securely strapped on top, and hit the road. There was a twinge of guilt for sneaking off like that, but the pull of the wild was impossible to resist. The drive to Baxter was both thrilling and peaceful. I'll never forget how the sunlight filtered through the autumn trees, painting the road in hues of gold and orange. It felt like I was driving straight into a masterpiece, one that only fall could create. When I arrived at the park, I was struck by its sheer vastness and isolation. It was exactly what I'd been hoping for, a place to unplug from everything. I drove to the launch point, unloaded the canoe, and paddled out into the park's heart. The water was like a mirror, perfectly reflecting the clear blue sky and the dense forest surrounding it. The stillness was almost surreal, with just the sound of my paddle slicing through the water and the occasional bird call. After a few miles, I found an ideal campsite, a little clearing surrounded by tall pines with a stunning view of the lake. Paddling to the shore, I felt a sense of satisfaction. This is it, I thought, my own slice of heaven. Setting up camp was quick work. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and unfolded my chair. Sitting by the crackling fire as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt completely at peace. All the stress and noise of daily life felt like it was a world away. As the day turned into evening, the chill in the air became sharper, but it was the kind of cold that made the warmth of the fire even better. I roasted marshmallows, a treat that always reminded me of simpler times. Exhausted from the day's adventure, I crawled into my tent and let the sounds of the night lull me to sleep. Crickets chirping and the occasional splash of a fish in the lake. It felt like the perfect end to a perfect day. But that peace didn't last. Sometime during the night, I woke abruptly to a noise. At first, I thought I might have been dreaming, but then I heard it again, a rustling sound outside my tent. My heart started pounding as I froze, listening. It's probably just a raccoon or a deer, I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. But the sound was deliberate and heavy, not like the light movements of a small animal. I tried to stay logical. I knew moose and black bears roamed these woods, and both could be dangerous if startled. But even though I reminded myself that wild animals usually avoid humans, the thought didn't make me feel any better. The rustling stopped right outside my tent, and my breath caught in my throat. Whatever it was right there. I could hear heavy breathing, slow and deliberate. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the darkness, but it was pitch black. I didn't dare move. The breathing eventually faded, and I heard the sound of branches snapping as it moved away. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But just as I was starting to feel relief, a chilling realization hit me. Whatever had been outside my tent wasn't walking on four legs. It was walking on two. The rest of the night was a blur of fear. I stayed awake, clutching the revolver I'd brought with me. A precaution I usually never needed, but now felt like my only lifeline. Morning couldn't come fast enough, and when it did, I packed up camp in record time. Even in daylight, the forest felt different, watchful, like something was lurking just out of sight. By evening, I couldn't shake the dread. I decided to stay inside my tent, revolver in hand. The night fell quickly, and the forest came alive with unsettling sounds. There were shadows moving around my tent, too tall and too deliberate to be animals I was familiar with. The sniffing and low growls grew louder and more numerous. I counted at least 5 or 6 of them, circling my tent. I was paralyzed with fear. Whatever these things were, they weren't normal animals. Their growls became rhythmic, almost like they were communicating. And then I realized they were preparing for something. In a burst of desperation, I fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed through the forest, and for a moment, everything went still. Seizing the opportunity, I tore through my tent and sprinted toward the lake. I didn't look back as I ran, branches slashing my face. I threw my canoe into the water and paddled with every ounce of strength I had. When I finally turned back, I saw them, 6 figures on the shore, their eyes reflecting the moonlight. They looked like massive wolves, but their movements were unnatural. Then, one by one, they stood upright on 2 legs. My blood turned to ice. They stared at me, howling into the night as I paddled away. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. Driving home, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? That night in Baxter State Park changed everything. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. The wilderness was once my refuge, but now it's a reminder of the night I came face to face with something beyond explanation. After watching your videos, I couldn't help but think of a terrifying moment in my life. A close call with what I can only guess was a skinwalker. This happened when I was about 19 years old, during a camping trip with some friends. We had watched a lot of videos about skinwalkers and had a habit of calling them thin snouts, for reasons we could never fully explain. I had always thought there might be some truth to their existence, so I decided to be well prepared for the trip. I packed my night vision goggles and my reliable .357 Magnum just in case. The first day of camping went by without a hitch, and we turned in for the night with no issues. But later that night, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside my tent, accompanied by a strange, high-pitched squeaking. My first thought was that my friends were trying to mess with me, maybe pretending to be an animal like a squirrel or something. Then a much darker thought crept in. What if it was a thin snout, disguised as a small animal? The idea felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next morning, I asked my friends if anyone else had heard noises during the night. To my surprise, none of them had, and they just laughed it off, saying it was probably a mouse. I was left alone with my uneasiness. The second day brought an unsettling twist. My buddy, who we called Tanner, suddenly went missing while I was grilling some burgers over the fire. At first, I didn't think much of it because, well, the burgers were amazing. But then I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from deep in the woods. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, like someone being attacked or screaming in pure terror. Grabbing my Magnum and a knife, I told the others to stay put and ran into the forest to find Tanner. He was my best friend, and I couldn't just stand by. As I searched, a metallic, coppery scent filled the air. It was the unmistakable smell of blood. I had read about this in stories, but never thought I'd experience it myself. I pushed through the fear and kept looking, but there was no sign of Tanner. The smell only grew stronger, but I tried to block it out and keep going. Eventually, I decided to head back to the campsite, hoping he might have returned on his own. When I got back, my stomach dropped. Everything at the campsite was gone except for the severed head of a deer, but something was horribly wrong with it. The deer's head had human-like teeth. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to convince myself it was some kind of elaborate prank. But the fact that Tanner was still missing weighed heavily on me. As night fell, I decided to use my expensive night vision goggles to scan the area. In the tree line, I saw shapes that looked like my friends just standing there, motionless. I slammed my fist on the table in frustration, and then I heard it. A faint whisper from right behind me. "It's here." Pure panic took over. I turned and started firing my magnum at whatever was behind me. When the smoke cleared, I realized I had shot Tanner. But something wasn't right. He was riddled with bullet holes, yet he didn't fall, didn't bleed, didn't speak. Fast forward 3 weeks. I was back at home on my small property, hanging out with my not-so-bright brother, Roy. We were relaxing when I heard a sound outside that made my heart stop. Bells ringing. I looked out the window, and there was Tanner standing in the yard. I was sure I'd killed him with those heavy rounds, but there he was, alive. He stared at me with an intensity that froze time. It felt like hours passed as we locked eyes, though it was probably just seconds. Then he turned and walked back into the woods without a word. A few weeks later, I ran into my friends again. When I brought up that camping trip, none of them remembered it ever happening. It was like the whole experience had been erased from their minds. To this day, I wonder if I experienced some kind of time slip, a curse, or something far stranger. What did I encounter that night? And what did I shoot? Those questions still haunt me. My name is Jeremy, and this is the story of how I lost a friend in the forests of New Mexico when I was 14. Something that still lingers in my mind, even after 18 years. Back then, our house was nestled in a remote area east of Gallup, surrounded by dense woods. My buddies Aaron, Ryan, and I were big fans of camping during our summer vacations. One summer, we decided to try something out of the ordinary. Instead of camping as a group, we chose to camp on our own and see how we'd handle being by ourselves. I picked a spot farther from our usual camping grounds, closer to open fields and meadows. It was the farthest from home I had ever ventured. Aaron decided to stay near our regular spot, while Ryan disappeared deep into the forest. Thankfully, we carried radios to stay in touch in case anything went wrong. We set out around 9 a.m. Aaron radioed in by midday to confirm he'd reached his location. I checked in sometime after lunch. But as the day went on, we became uneasy because we hadn't heard from Ryan. Finally, the radio came alive and Ryan reported finding a spot, though it was pretty late. Much later than I expected. We each set up our tents, built small campfires, and settled down beneath the starry sky. Everything felt normal, or at least it seemed that way. Around midnight, my radio started making odd noises. It sounded like someone was trying to speak, but the signal was weak. I grabbed it, thinking it might be Ryan, but it turned out to be Aaron. He asked how things were, and I told him everything was fine. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of why it had taken Ryan so long to settle. He mentioned he was far out, beyond the hills about a mile from where I was. Ryan had wandered deep into the forest. While it seemed unusual, he assured us the place was great, so we all went back to sleep. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone sprinting past my tent. Assuming it was Aaron, I unzipped the flap and looked outside, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I called out, thinking maybe Ryan was pulling a prank, but whoever it was kept running without even looking back. They vanished into the trees. Annoyed, I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area, but there was nothing. Frustrated, I radioed Ryan to ask if he'd been near my camp. He denied it, saying he was still at his own spot. I insisted it had to be him since I'd seen him, or at least thought I had, running by my camp not once but 3 times during the night. Each time, they bolted past without a word. At dawn, I got in touch with Aaron. He'd also had a rough night. He mentioned Ryan had shown up at his camp asking for help but wouldn't answer any questions. Aaron called out to him, but Ryan just stood there, repeating the same thing over and over before wandering off into the woods again. Baffled and concerned, we decided to find Ryan's camp and figure out what was going on. After walking for nearly a mile and following some tracks in the mud, we found his campsite in a clearing. It was a mess. His tent had been torn apart, His belongings were scattered everywhere, and his radio had been smashed and tossed into the remains of a cold campfire. Trash was strewn across the area. We searched for him for hours but found nothing. Eventually, we climbed a hill to get a better view of the surroundings. That's when we spotted him, or at least what we thought was him, standing on another hill not far from us. Relieved, we hurried toward him, but as we got closer, something felt off. Aaron stopped abruptly and held me back, telling me to wait. The person standing there grinned at us, but the smile was unnaturally wide, stretching far beyond what was normal. As we approached, it became clear this wasn't Ryan. Its body was twisted and malformed, as if its limbs had been pulled inward, leaving its arms and legs unnaturally thin. It moved in an unnatural way, its expressions completely wrong. Suddenly, it dropped to all fours and began sprinting toward us, its movements unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its body contorted as it ran, its skin stretched tightly over a skeletal frame, its head elongated, and its mouth opened into a circular void. As it moved, it screamed in what sounded like Ryan's voice, but it was distorted, like a recording gone horribly wrong. To this day, I can't fully explain what we saw. I don't talk about it often because most people wouldn't believe me. If anyone reading this has any idea what we encountered or what might have happened to Ryan, I'd appreciate hearing your thoughts. My name is Mia, and I live in the town of Asheville, North Carolina, with my dog, Rex. Rex is the light of my life. He's a mixed breed husky with mostly dark fur but white streaks around his legs and face, and little rings of dark fur around his pale blue eyes that make him look like a mischievous character from a cartoon. I found him at a shelter when he was just a pup, right after my fiancée moved to Hong Kong for work. He helped me cope with the loneliness during the nights when I couldn't stand going to bed alone for the 100th time. Over the years, when my husband chose to start a family with a woman from his workplace, Rex helped me get through the heartbreak. Rex is a big dog, like a subwoofer on 4 legs. While most dogs need regular walks, Rex needs hiking adventures. So, every weekend, I take him to the Pisgah National Forest, one of the few places where he could really run wild. Dogs, in my opinion, aren't meant to be kept inside. They need space to explore, to feel free, and the forest was perfect for that. And honestly, I needed that too. A place to escape from the stress of my demanding job. The woods were my sanctuary. That all changed one chilly October day when I learned why humans built cities and towns. Because sometimes the wilderness isn't our friend. Rex had always been in his element in the forest. For such a majestic dog, he could be so goofy, and the woods brought that out in him. When he was free, his blue eyes would widen, his tongue hanging out, as he ran with joy, making me laugh at his silliness. But one day I noticed a shift. Rex, usually loud and boisterous, became a quivering mess, barely moving more than a few feet from me. It was unlike him, and I was concerned. When I stroked his neck, I felt him trembling. At first, I thought it might be a mountain lion nearby. Last year, Rex had become overly aggressive after an encounter with something I thought was a predator. The previous summer, there had been a rise in black bear sightings in the area, and local homeowners were warned to take extra precautions. It was possible that Rex had caught wind of a bear and her cubs, but his reaction wasn't just cautious. It was pure terror. I didn't know what to make of it, but it was clear that Rex wanted out of there, and so did I. The problem was we'd already hiked a long way into the forest, and getting out wouldn't be quick. The further we went, the more anxious Rex became. He kept looking back with fear in his eyes, darting ahead, then returning to whine at me. I felt the fear too. Every step seemed faster than the last, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind us, even though I never saw anything. At one point, Rex ran back to my side and froze, staring at the woods as he sniffed the air. I thought it was over, But I was wrong. With a yelp that hurt my ears, he bolted ahead, barking frantically. That's when I heard it. A rustling behind me, and a massive creature breathing heavily. I ran, following Rex's barks as the branches tore at my face. I've never been so terrified in my life, knowing that something was hunting us. It wasn't something I could reason with or escape from. I ran until I couldn't anymore, gasping for breath, shaking with fear. I had to keep going. Rex's barks urged me on, and I couldn't afford to stop. But the forest was dense, and I couldn't see clearly, making it easy to trip. I fell hard, gasping for air as I hit the ground. As I lay there, Rex came to my side, barking fiercely as he defended me with every ounce of strength he had. It was terrifying, but also inspiring. I was so grateful that he was there, but even his bravery wasn't enough to hold off the beast. The sound of it roaring through the trees silenced him, and he rushed to grab my coat, trying to drag me along. That's when survival kicked in, and I was back on my feet, running again. The fear for Rex consumed me. What if he couldn't handle this? But he never left my side, always barking to make sure I knew where to go. Then we reached a riverbank. It wasn't wide, but Rex hated water. I knew he wouldn't jump, so I begged him, promising him treats, anything to get him across. But Rex froze, pacing up and down, too scared to cross. The thing behind us was getting closer. I pleaded with him, even offered him food, but he refused. Then, in a moment of pure panic, Rex darted back into the woods, heading toward whatever was chasing us. I felt like I was going to collapse. I couldn't bear to lose him. But then, out of nowhere, he came charging back toward me, leaping over the river in a single bound, his eyes wide with surprise and mine just as shocked. It was like watching an action movie. Rex landed, scrambling to safety, and we both kept running. I was exhausted, my legs burning, my breath shallow, but I couldn't stop. My heart was racing, and I felt like I might pass out at any second. I was gasping for air when I saw something move in front of me, something that wasn't Rex. I thought that was it, that I was done. But the next thing I knew, I woke up in the back of a pickup truck. A stranger, wearing hunting gear, was handing me water. I drank it in large gulps, and after a moment of panic, I realized that Rex was nowhere to be seen. I asked the stranger about him, and he told me Rex was fine, just inside their lodge getting some food. I cried with relief, but then the hunter told me something that made me cry even harder. Rex wouldn't leave the truck for a while, staying by my side, waiting for me to wake up. I felt so grateful that he was okay. I spent the next few hours recovering at the lodge, telling the hunters what happened. I mentioned the bear I thought we'd encountered, but I knew that wasn't the real threat. The hunters didn't have an answer, and when I asked if it could have been a grizzly, one of them said it was possible. But I knew that wasn't true. Grizzlies don't live anywhere near North Carolina. Those hunters saved my life, and I'll be forever thankful to them. But I know they were hiding something. I haven't figured out exactly what chased us that day, but I'll never forget the fear in Rex's eyes, or the terrifying silence in the woods. As I sit here writing this, Rex is lying beside me, ever faithful, ever watchful. In my darkest moments, I wonder how I'll cope without him. He's my protector, my hero. The story my grandfather shared with me has always stuck with me. He served in the military during World War II. On his 18th birthday, March 3, 1944, he joined the war. That timing meant he missed the D-Day landings and all the horror that came with it, but he was in time to take part in something even worse, the invasion of Germany itself. In hindsight, it's clear that Germany was doomed to lose the war, crushed by the combined power of the Allies and the Soviet Union. However, in the thick of it, in the fields and forests of Northern Europe, no one could have predicted the outcome. Germany still held out hope for victory, believing that the development of atomic bombs or stubborn defense tactics might turn the tide. It was into this uncertain phase of the war that my grandfather found himself, caught up in a brutal push into Germany. The Battle of Aachen began on October 2, 1944, as the Allies aimed to capture the city quickly to move on to the industrial Ruhr Basin, which was crucial to German war production. But just a few miles south lay the dense Hürtgen forest, where more than 80,000 German soldiers were positioned. The U.S. Army Task Force was sent into the woods to keep these troops from reinforcing Aachen. That's where my grandfather's story begins. His platoon had been assigned to patrol through the forest, searching for German positions. It had been a quiet morning until a distant rifle shot rang out. One of his comrades fell to the ground. The soldiers scrambled for cover, but it took a while to figure out where the shots were coming from. In the meantime, 3 or 4 more soldiers were hit by the sniper's bullets. Some tried to retreat under cover, but the sniper picked them off before they could make it. Soon, the entire platoon was trapped, unable to move without risking death. But that wasn't the worst part of the ordeal. The radio operator had been the first to fall. He bled out quickly, lying in a small clearing. Any soldier who tried to move him or the radio was shot at by the sniper, keeping them at bay. One man managed to grab the radio, but the sniper shot his hand, rendering it useless. Without the radio, they couldn't call for artillery or air support. More than 20 men were at the mercy of a single German sniper. My grandfather told me that every time one of the soldiers shifted position, maybe trying to spot the sniper, someone would fall, dead or screaming in pain. And each time, the sniper would laugh. The sound of his laughter, echoing through the trees, is what my grandfather said he could never forget. The joy the sniper took in each kill was chilling. Sometimes, the sniper would shout something, words my grandfather couldn't understand at the time, but later learned were Mars in der Morgen, something like March in the morning. The platoon was pinned down for 6 hours, though it felt like days. They had to lie there, completely still, as the bodies of their fallen comrades stared at them. One of the dead men, who had bled out against a tree, became a target for the sniper. Unable to find living targets, the sniper began shooting at the corpse, seemingly to torment the platoon mentally. My grandfather said they all flinched as each bullet hit the dead man's skull, making it crack open. The soldier's face, once familiar, had been distorted by the force of the shots, so much so that my grandfather barely recognized him. The sniper laughed louder as he kept shooting, turning the man's skull into a mess of bone and brain. My grandfather told me that seeing such a thing was unimaginable for someone so young. He was just 18, still a kid. It was something I can't even picture, though I know he was just a kid too. They waited for nightfall to escape, and as they moved back, the sniper's laughter still echoed through the trees. One soldier was so frightened that he ran straight into a tree, breaking his nose, but kept going. My grandfather passed away last year, and I think of him often, especially when I remember what he went through. This is my tribute to a brave man who survived such horrors. Rest in peace, Grandpa. One of the tallest volcanoes in Asia, Mount Fuji is also one of Japan's most revered sites. It is an iconic cultural symbol, and on clear days, people in Tokyo can often spot its perfectly symmetrical, snow-covered peaks in the distance. Mount Fuji is a frequent subject in art and photography, appearing on countless postcards sent across the globe each year from Japan. To the northwest of Mount Fuji, within 230 square kilometers of hardened lava, lies a forest called Keigahara, known also as the Sea of Trees. The forest can be dense in some areas, with the porous lava rocks in the forest absorbing sound, creating a profound sense of solitude. This eerie silence draws visitors for activities like hiking and camping, But Keigahara is also known for something darker. The forest has a reputation in Japanese culture as the home of the eerie, spirits of the dead from Japanese folklore. This reputation stems from the forest being a common site where people end their lives. Each year, many people venture into Keigahara to take their own lives. These tragic events have become so frequent in the past half-century that Japanese authorities have placed signs at trailheads, urging people to reconsider their actions and contact suicide prevention hotlines. In 2003 alone, over 100 bodies were discovered in the forest, a rise from the previous year's 78. By 2010, police reported more than 200 attempts in the forest, with around 50 successful deaths. Despite numerous warnings, the forest remains a place for such tragic acts, with hanging and overdoses being the most common methods. It is notable that suicides in Keigahara tend to increase in March, marking the end of Japan's fiscal year, when many face extreme pressures in their personal or professional lives. Local officials have even tried to reduce the public focus on these deaths to prevent Keigahara's growing fame as a destination for such acts. This trend may have been influenced by the 1961 novel Nami Note, written by Saiko Matsumoto, known in English as The Tower of Waves. The story centers on a couple who, unable to be together, take a trip to the woods near Mount Fuji to end their lives. The novel remains one of the most romanticized stories in Japanese literature, though it is not solely to blame for the suicides in the forest. Another influential work is Wataru Sorum's Kunsen ji Satsuma Neru, a manual published in 1993 on the methods of ending one's life, which sold over 1 million copies in Japan. In the book's postscript, the author, while not promoting suicide, argues that escaping life's pain through death can make living easier, reflecting a grim philosophy against societal pressures. The book, detailing various suicide methods and their respective ease, pain, and failure rates, was highly controversial at the time. Despite these cultural works, the association of Keigahara with death dates back much earlier. There was an ancient Japanese practice called batsui, where elderly relatives, unable to care for themselves, were abandoned in remote places to die. This practice persisted into the 19th century, long after other cultures had developed palliative care for the elderly. It is this tradition that led to Keigahara being considered haunted, as the spirits of those left to die may still wander the forest. In more recent years, the forest received renewed public attention thanks to a YouTuber, Logan Paul, who posted a controversial video in which he filmed a body in the forest. The video, showing a man who had taken his own life, sparked widespread outrage when Paul and his friends seemed to make light of the situation. The backlash was immense, with Paul's video being viewed millions of times before it was removed. YouTube removed Paul from its Google Preferred program and halted other projects with him in response. This event brought renewed focus to the dark reality of suicide in Japan, where more than 25,000 people take their own lives every year, about 70 each day, most of them men. In 2014, another tragic incident occurred when a 71-year-old man set himself on fire on a bullet train, forcing the issue of suicide into the headlines once again. It raised a grim question: what drives a person to choose death over life? For as long as such questions remain unanswered, the Keigahara forest will continue to be a place where the lost souls are remembered, with colored ribbons marking their paths. My name is Amelia, and I live in the lush forests of the Pacific Northwest, specifically in the state of Washington. One of my resolutions for 2020 was to shed the extra weight I gained during my first pregnancy, weight that had knocked my confidence and left me feeling sluggish. My husband always reassured me that he loved me just the way I was, but I wanted to feel my best for him, just like he did for me. The problem was, I've never really enjoyed the atmosphere in co-ed gyms. Some places just seem like all people care about is meeting each other or checking each other out. On the other hand, Some female-only gyms were poorly funded, making them not worth my time. So I decided to try hiking. I'd always believed the great outdoors could do wonders for my mental health, and I had used walks in the woods to fight off postpartum depression, which had helped a lot. I remember the excitement I felt when I drove to a sporting goods store to buy a good pair of hiking boots, along with a lot of waterproof gear in vibrant lilac, my favorite color. It felt like the beginning of something great. I even started asking for hiking gear advice in an online forum and couldn't wait to update everyone on my progress. But my first real solo hike was far from the peaceful experience I had imagined, and it made me develop a whole new respect for nature's unpredictability. My husband agreed to watch the baby while I drove out to the Olympic National Forest for an afternoon hike. Everything went smoothly for about an hour as I pushed myself uphill, feeling my thighs burn. The downhill stretches felt amazing, but then I tripped. I'm not sure what happened. Maybe my boot caught on a rock or something hidden in the dirt, but I ended up rolling and landing hard. I clutched my ankle in pain, but I could still put some weight on it, so it wasn't too bad, just a sprain. But it hurt a lot. That's when the strangest and cutest thing happened. A crow flew down from a tree and landed on a nearby stump. It began hopping around, flapping its wings, and calling out like it was singing for food. It seemed to have seen me fall and had come to check if I was okay. I told the crow I was fine, just a little shaken up, and it quieted down, eyeing me curiously. With my ankle still aching, I managed to get back on my feet, waved goodbye to my crow friend, and limped toward my car. But what happened next was the sweetest thing. The crow followed me, flying from tree to tree, keeping close to me as I slowly shuffled along, calling out every so often to check in. It felt so comforting, especially since the fall had shaken my confidence. The kindness of nature, in the form of this little crow, really lifted my spirits. But before long, my ankle began to swell, and with the swelling came more pain. As the pain intensified, it reminded me of the labor I'd gone through giving birth, and sitting on a fallen log to rest, I suddenly burst into tears. That's when my little crow friend swooped down again, singing its little tune and hopping around in concern. It felt like a scene out of a fairy tale, like something you'd see in a movie, where the princess is crying and her bird friend comes to comfort her. But then, something happened that made my heart race in fear. From about 100 yards up the hill, I heard something large moving through the trees. Something that drooled as it got closer. It was a grizzly bear, fresh out of hibernation, and it was clearly starving. The crow began its frantic calling and hopping again. But this time, it felt different, urgent. At first, I thought it was warning me, but I was wrong. The bear charged down the hill, its steps rapid and heavy, as it rushed toward me. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the bear spray I had bought after advice from my hiking group online, quickly removed the safety, and sprayed a wide cloud of bright yellow mist into the air. I was terrified, convinced the bear wouldn't be stopped, that it would tear me apart no matter what. But to my shock, it worked. As soon as the bear ran into the cloud of spray, it stopped dead in its tracks, blinked, and then started sneezing violently as the spray took effect. I didn't hang around to celebrate. Who would? I ran, as fast as I could with my swollen ankle, not stopping until I finally reached my car. Somehow, I managed to drive back home and I lived to tell the tale. Later, I did some research, and what I thought was my kind little crow friend wasn't what I'd imagined at all. As it turns out, crows have a special relationship with bears. When they see a wounded or weak animal, they'll swoop down and call out to attract predators, often leading bears to the injured creature. Once the bear is done, the crow gets to eat the leftovers. That day in the woods, I learned the crow wasn't there to help me. It was just doing what it does to help itself. If the bear had gotten to me first, I would have been the leftovers. I beg you, please listen to me. Do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Vermont. I know those woods like the back of my hand. I spent my childhood playing there with my younger brother, even before I hit double digits. Trust me when I say that something has changed in those woods, and not for the better. I first realized something was terribly wrong a few weeks ago, during an early spring hike. In March, thousands of small songbirds return from their southern migration to the forests around Mount Greylock. Their songs are sweet at first, but are really challenges, a way to warn rivals to stay away. But that day, there was nothing.
No birds.
No animals at all. It made me uneasy for two reasons. One, animals can sense danger long before we do. Their smell, hearing, and ability to read the atmosphere are far sharper than ours. If they'd fled the area so suddenly or refused to return, something bad could be about to happen. Two, forests get quiet when a large predator is nearby. Animals like wood pigeons will go completely still when they sense a bear or a mountain lion. Sometimes the predator moves on. Other times it doesn't. Either way, it wouldn't be safe to wander around in an area like that. So I decided to head back to my car. But that's when something strange happened. I grew up near Mount Greylock, exploring its woods with my brother for years. It was a little ways from where we lived, but with our bikes, we had a large territory to cover during the summer breaks. I knew that forest better than anyone, but somehow this time I got lost. I realized it when a dull headache began to throb in my head. I paused to rub my eyes and try to ease the pain, but when I opened them again, I was struck by a sense of panic. The woods looked unfamiliar. That was impossible. How could a place I knew so well feel so alien? I took out my compass to figure out where I was, but the needle wouldn't stay still, kept moving. I tried to adjust it, but it was no use. The compass wouldn't settle. At first, I didn't think it was a big deal. Sure, it was unnerving, but I could still find my way out. I tried to rely on the moss, which usually grows on the north side of trees, but when I checked, I noticed the sun was in the south. If not that, then the moss grew on the southern sides of the trees. It didn't add up. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more my panic grew. But I forced myself to stay calm. Panic only leads to mistakes, and I knew there had to be a reasonable explanation. I tried walking in what I hoped was the direction of the nearest road. That's when I found it. Something I'd never seen before, something completely out of place. In all the years I'd spent in these woods with my brother, I had never seen the old cabin that stood before me. I'm talking about a cabin so old, there was no way it could have been built after 1979. How could my brother and I have missed it? I had no idea. Naturally, I thought about knocking, maybe asking if anyone could give me directions. But as I walked closer to the cabin, something strange began to happen. At first, I thought I was just tired, maybe my blood sugar was low, but each step I took toward that cabin became harder. By the time I was at the door, it felt like something was pushing me away. It was as if the very air around me was whispering, "Leave this place. Never return. Don't look back." I knocked, and the door creaked open a little. The inside was just as run down as the outside. It looked abandoned, but there was something odd about the way the furniture was arranged. It almost seemed like someone came by every now and then. But there, in the corner, was something that caught my eye. What I saw was something I can't even describe properly. It was a wooden figure, a small idol, placed on a stone altar. My brain couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. The headache returned, sharper than before, and the anxiety hit me so hard I thought I might pass out. That idol, made of twigs, vines, and moss, was evil. Pure evil. And I ran. I ran like a terrified child, straight out of the cabin and into the night. The weirdest part? It was still daylight when I entered the cabin. I couldn't have been inside for more than a couple of minutes. Yet when I burst through the door, it was pitch dark outside. I ran until I found the road, found my car, and drove home like a madman. I haven't told anyone about what happened to me until now. I tried to explain it to a hunting buddy once, but the words wouldn't come out. Please heed my warning. Don't go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Vermont. The fading glow from our campfire cast strange shadows that flickered across the tired faces of my friends. Laughter, once light and free, now had a strained edge. We were lost, completely and desperately lost. It had been a reckless idea from the start, an unplanned weekend hike into the uncharted depths of Echo Woods, fueled by youthful pride and a craving for adventure. The map, an old relic found in my grandfather's attic, promised a hidden lake, pristine and untouched. Captivated by the unknown, the five of us had set off. Now, as dusk thickened, the oppressive quiet of the forest gnawed at our nerves. We had been trekking for hours, the map useless by now, the thick canopy swallowing what was left of daylight. By some stroke of luck, we stumbled into a small clearing, a forgotten campsite nestled among the towering pines. It felt like an answer to our silent prayers, and a wave of relief washed over me as we unpacked our things. Olivia was quick to inspect the spot, finding an old fire pit outlined with blackened stones. Mike, the practical one, declared it perfect for a morale-boosting fire. Emily, unusually quiet, kept glancing nervously at the dense woods surrounding us. Tom, normally the voice of calm, was oddly silent, his eyes filled with an unsettling fear. We settled down for the night as the fire crackled, casting a warm glow while the first stars appeared. Mike shared ghost stories, though with less enthusiasm than usual. Olivia, ever the skeptic, dismissed his tales, but I felt chills run down my spine with each eerie story. The night became a cacophony of unnerving sounds, the rustling of unseen breezes, the haunting hoot of an owl, and the snapping of twigs under invisible footsteps. Sleep came only in snatches, haunted by dreams of twisting shadows and watching eyes. Dawn arrived reluctantly, casting a pale light. Exhausted, we ate a small breakfast, broken only by the clinking of spoons. Tom, looking pale and haggard, broke the silence. We need to find our way out. Supplies are running low. The day passed in a fog of frustration as we walked in circles, the forest seeming to mock our efforts. Landmarks appeared, only to vanish. Paths reappeared as if to taunt us. The sun, once our guide, offered no direction in the thick canopy. Panic began to rise, gnawing at our sanity. By nightfall, we found ourselves back at the campsite, as if it were toying with us. Everything lay exactly as we'd left it. The rearranged logs, the half-burned sticks, even the chipped mug that Olivia had dropped earlier. This time, Olivia, usually strong, broke down, tears streaming down her face. Emily, wide-eyed with fear, whispered about being trapped in a loop. The next few days merged into a grim blend of hunger, desperation, and dread. Days blurred into nights, with the campfire as the only source of light in our decaying world. Mike, once full of energy, grew withdrawn, his eyes distant with despair. Tom, always the prepared one, lost his composure, mumbling about unseen forces working against us. Emily, the quiet observer, became a hollow shell, her eyes fixed on something invisible in the dark. One by one, they began to vanish. First, it was Mike. We found him near the fire pit, his eyes frozen in terror, a single scratch across his neck. Then Tom. We discovered him hanging from a low branch, his face frozen in defeat. Olivia disappeared without a trace, leaving me alone. Loneliness became a frightening companion, hunger gnawing at me and fear keeping me awake. The forest pulsed with a hidden malice, the creaking trees forming a sinister chorus. On the night of the full moon, As I searched for food, I found a hidden compartment in the fire pit. Inside, among the ashes, lay a weathered journal. Its damp, cold cover bore faded words of explorers who had ventured into Echo Woods centuries ago, drawn by a hidden lake, only to become trapped in a time loop, haunted by forest spirits. The final entry spoke of an offering to calm an unseen force. Despair nearly overwhelmed me, but a small spark of defiance flared within. I wouldn't be another lost soul. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out the forest sounds. Sacrifice, the word echoed in my mind. But a sacrifice of what? Blood? The thought made me shiver. Then it dawned on me, it wasn't blood that was needed, but the act of letting go. Hands shaking, I searched my backpack for the one thing of value left, the faded map that had led us here. It was a desperate move, but all I had. Holding it over the fire pit, I muttered a prayer I didn't realize I still remembered. I give up the path. I give up the lake. Take this and let me go. A wave of nausea hit me as I dropped the map into the fire. The flames flared up, filling the clearing with an intense orange glow before fading. An eerie silence followed, as though the forest held its breath. The hours crawled by until dawn finally arrived, bringing with it a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. The forest felt lighter, somehow. Tentative hope broke through my fear as I started walking. The forest, though unchanged, now seemed to lead me forward rather than twist to trap me. After hours of walking, just as doubt began to creep in, the trees parted, and there it was, a shimmering lake reflecting the morning sky. Relief washed over me, mingling with bitter loss. Had it all been real or some horrible dream? As I neared the water, something shiny caught my eye. Half submerged lay a compass I'd given up on finding. Its needle spun before locking onto a single direction, the way out. I left without looking back, and the trek out was grueling, but I faced it with a new resolve. Days later, I stumbled out of the forest, a gaunt, weary figure. The sight of the road brought a sob from deep within. I was free. The news reported us missing, presumed dead. They found our campsite, untouched, the fire still burning. A chilling reminder of what we had endured. The map was never found. Some say the forest claimed it. Others whisper of a shadowy hand that reached from the flames to take its prize. The nightmares still come, vivid and terrifying, but with them is a haunting understanding. Echo Woods holds its own secrets, a dark power that I, the lone survivor, will always carry. I may have escaped that cursed campsite, but a part of me will always remain there, bound to the depths of Echo Woods, an unspoken offering to the unseen entity that rules over lost souls. The setting sun, a bruised, dusky orange, seeped through the thick canopy, casting an eerie glow on the tangled path. Sweat clung to my shirt as an unseen chorus of insects filled the muggy air. I shouldn't have left the marked trail. This barely there path branching off the main one had seemed promising, maybe even a shortcut or a chance to explore. But now, unease gnawed at me like a relentless mosquito. Silence settled heavily, broken only by the squish of wet leaves under my boots. The trees here seemed ancient, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes, clawing skyward. The air was thick with the smell of decaying plants, making it hard to breathe. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A deer, perhaps? My heart raced, but what stepped from behind an old, misshapen oak was no deer. It was a woman. Her clothes were torn, caked in mud, and her hair, a mess of knotted straw, obscured most of her face. Only her eyes showed, impossibly black, piercing into me. I could barely manage a greeting before she spoke, her voice a raspy growl that sent chills down my spine. "Lost, are you?" she croaked. I stammered, nodding. Yeah, I took a wrong turn. She laughed, a sound like dead leaves scraping across the ground. Her laughter stopped suddenly. Lost or lured? She rasped, her words carrying a dark implication that made my stomach drop. I mumbled a denial, weakly trying to shake off my fear. She just stared, those black eyes seeming to dig into my soul. Then, as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. 1 second there, the next replaced by eerie silence. Heart pounding, I spun around, looking for any trace of her. Nothing. Shaken, I told myself maybe she was just a hermit or a trick of the oppressive atmosphere. But her eyes, those endless dark eyes, stayed with me, a cold dread creeping into my gut. Determined to find my way back to the main trail, I pressed on. The path narrowed, sunlight barely reaching through the dense undergrowth. The air grew colder, a damp chill soaking into my bones. Then I saw it. A cabin, falling apart, nestled among the trees. Thin wisps of smoke curled from its chimney against the dimming sky. Desperate for some sign of humanity, though terrified of the unknown, I walked toward it. An old man sat on the porch, rocking slowly in a chair that creaked with each movement. He was gaunt, his face a web of wrinkles, a scruffy beard framing sunken eyes. He looked up as I approached, his eyes echoing the same disturbing darkness I'd seen in the woman's. "Lost, are you?" he murmured, his voice dry. The same question again. I shivered, nodding. My voice barely managed a whisper. He gestured to an empty rocking chair beside him. "Sit," he invited. Every instinct urged me to leave, but curiosity kept me there. I sat, my body tense, ready to bolt. His gaze was intense, pinning me in place. "You shouldn't be here," he finally rasped, barely audible over the creaking of his chair. "I know," I muttered, regretting my detour. "I took a wrong turn. Some paths aren't meant to be found," he said, his voice tinged with warning. Suddenly, a sharp knock came from inside the cabin, breaking the silence. The old man's face paled with fear. "Who's there?" he whispered, voice trembling. The knocking grew louder. A cold dread filled me. I wanted to be anywhere but here. "Stay here," he said, his voice barely audible, and he rose with surprising agility, disappearing into the cabin. Despite my fear, curiosity pulled me closer. I peeked through the doorway. Inside, a shadowy figure stood with its back to me, tall and gaunt, vaguely human-shaped. It knocked again, its knuckles making a dull thud on the weathered wood. The old man mumbled in a language I didn't understand, his voice shaking. Then, the figure spoke back in a low, guttural growl that made the floorboards vibrate. Its words sounded unearthly, a disturbing mix of hisses and clicks that sent shivers down my spine. The old man whimpered, and there was a sickening thud. A wave of nausea hit me. Instinct took over, and I bolted from the porch, adrenaline surging. I didn't look back, but the old man's faint screams echoed behind me. The forest had turned into a dark labyrinth. Every branch and rustle took on a sinister tone. I stumbled through the underbrush, lungs burning and heart pounding. Suddenly, the sounds behind me ceased. I stopped, leaning against a giant tree, gasping for breath. The silence was heavy, broken only by the thumping of my own heartbeat. The last light of day had gone, replaced by the eerie glow of a nearly full moon. Then, out of the shadows, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared, staring back at me. Terror seized me. A figure emerged from behind a twisted tree, humanoid, impossibly tall, its skin mottled gray, its eyes blazing red. It moved toward me, its long, clawed fingers twitching. My legs felt weak, betraying me when I needed them most. The creature let out a sound like a twisted laugh, sending chills down my spine. Just as it lunged, another scream echoed through the night. Not human, but enough to make the creature pause. Taking advantage of the moment, I ran, not caring where, just away. The forest stretched endlessly, a maze of shadows. I tripped, scraping my hands on the rough bark of a fallen log. Tears blurred my vision, but through them, I saw a faint light in the distance. Hope surged through me, a lifeline in the darkness. Ignoring the pain in my knees, I stumbled toward it. The light grew, revealing another decayed cabin in a clearing. Smoke curled from its chimney. On the porch stood a woman, her back to me. Her ragged clothes and messy hair looked familiar. Could it be the same woman? My heart raced, torn between fear and the need for human contact. I called out, my voice barely a whisper. She turned slowly, her face deeply lined but lacking that dark, unsettling look in her eyes. There was a weary kindness in them. She beckoned me closer without a word. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the porch steps. She knelt beside me, her expression a blend of concern and curiosity. "You're lost," she said softly. I nodded, unable to find words. She handed me a water skin, and I drank deeply, the cool water easing me. I recounted my experience with the old man, the creature, and the overwhelming fear that had haunted me. She listened, her brow creasing as I spoke. "These woods," she began, voice low, "hold memories best left undisturbed." She explained the forest was a strange place where time lost meaning, a tangled web woven by ancient forces. The old man, she revealed, had been a keeper, a guardian of the true path. But his cries, still echoing in my mind, hinted at failure. She herself, she admitted, was another guardian, one with a darker purpose. "I create illusions," she said, her eyes glinting in a way that unsettled me, drawing in wanderers rather than leading them away. Dread washed over me as I realized that the path I'd veered from was probably my way to safety. This woman had led me deeper into the forest's decaying heart. "Why?" I asked, the full weight of my situation sinking in. Her smile turned chilling, a mockery of human warmth. "We need new stories," she replied, her voice shifting, merging with a chorus of whispers and strange sounds, as if countless voices were pouring from her mouth. My blood froze. There was no escape. I was trapped, bound to this strange place and its terrifying secrets. As dawn cast a reddish glow on the skeletal trees, the woman's form seemed to change, her hand stretching into a clawed shape. "Welcome," she rasped, her voice an eerie harmony of whispers, "to your new role." The staff I clutched clattered to the ground, its warmth fading. The forest, once only a place of shadow and whispers, now pulsed with a dark energy. Branches reached out, clawing at my ankles, anchoring me. Panic clawed at me, but escape was impossible. I was trapped, bound to become something twisted and dark, a figure no longer offering safety to the lost. Instead, I would create illusions of my own, leading souls deeper into the forest's tangled web of forgotten memories. As the forest echoed with laughter, no longer that of the pursued, but a sinister welcome, I felt my identity slipping away. The memory of who I once was, the life I'd left, began to fade, as broken as the filtered sunlight through the decaying canopy. In my place, a new horror emerged, a hollow echo of humanity, entwined with the despair and madness of the forest. And so, the cycle continued, the forest claiming another soul, adding its dark twist to the story of the vanishing wanderer. A hidden truth, buried beneath layers of illusion and forgotten tales, warning of the price for stepping off the well-trodden path.